witnesses, I propose to call the Shadow Minister to ask the first question. Then I will call the Minister and then the Liberal Democrat spokesperson. I will then go back and forth between the government and opposition sides. And anyone who wants to ask a question, please do catch my eye. We must stick to the cut-off time specified in the programme motion, so I will need to interrupt questioning if necessary. And can I remind members that they must declare any relevant interests both when speaking in committee and when asking questions. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask? So we are now broadcasting, and before we start hearing from the witnesses, do any members wish to make a declaration of interest in connection with this bill?
Refer to my... thank you, Ms Voss. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. Refer to my register of interests and of financial interest in relation to my membership of Unite and the GMB.
Neil Griffin.
Yeah, refer to my entry in members' interests and my membership of STUC.
Michael Wheeler.
I refer to my declaration in the register of interests and my membership of GMB and STUC.
Annalise Midgley.
I refer to my declaration of interests and my membership of Unite and the GMB.
Alison Hume.
Thank you. I refer to my declaration of interests and my membership of UNISON and the Writers' Guild of Great Britain.
John Pearce.
I refer to my declaration in the register of interests and I'm a member of the GMB.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you. I again refer to my declaration in the register of interests and my membership of the GMB and United Trade Unions.
Alex McIntyre.
I'm a member of GMB and Community Unions and until the election a member of the Employment Lawyers Association.
Murray Tidwell.
I refer members, as I did this morning, to my declaration of interest and also to my membership of Community Union, Unison and GMB.
Uma Kamaran.
Thank you, Chair. I refer members to my declaration of interest and my membership of the GMB Union.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. I refer members to my declaration of interest and my membership of Unison and Community Trade Unions.
Anyone else? No? No one else? So, we will now hear oral evidence from Alan Simpson, the Deputy CEO of UKHospitality, and Neil Carberry, Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. So we have until 2:30 for this panel. So could I ask the witnesses to introduce themselves briefly for this session? Mr. Carberry.
Neil Carberry. I'm the Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, which is the sector body for the UK's talent, recruitment and staffing businesses. We represent about 3,200, mostly family-owned businesses across the UK.
Well, hello everyone, I'm Alan Simpson. I'm the Deputy CEO of UKHospitality, which, as the name suggests, represents a hospitality sector in the UK, which is about 3.5 million people in total.
Okay, thank you very much. First question, Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mrs. Fowles. Pleasure to see you in the chair and to serve under your chairmanship. Good afternoon. Could I start, please, with Mr. Simpson? UKHospitality have been quite critical of this bill in the media, in the wider setting. You've just said you represent a very large number of people. Do you think after this bill is passed and becomes an act, I think we can safely assume it will with the parliamentary arithmetic at the moment, there will be more or fewer people employed in hospitality in the United Kingdom?
I'd slightly reject your characterisation. Actually, I think in general we agree with the principles behind the reforms, and actually many of the substantial reforms themselves as well. There are areas where we will have to nuance the detail of things like reference periods on 0 hours contracts. We'll get into quite a bit of that, I'm sure. But my bigger concern is the aggregate cost of what we saw in the budget, with the regressive impact on lower earners in particular. Will this create more or fewer jobs? I think the government's analysis suggests that it's fewer, but let's balance that against making sure that workers' rights are protected as well.
So, and Mr. Carberry, I will come to you shortly, but Mr. Simpson, to continue on that theme, this is a pretty wide-ranging bill. There are a lot of measures in it. Which of them do you think the government has wrong and that you would like to see either deleted or amended?
Well, I've got a red, amber, green list in front of me, so I can tell you what's on the red if that's useful. I think, first of all, it is the aggregate cost. The cost of this alongside the employer national insurance and the national living wage increases is going to be a barrier to employment, and you can take the £50,000 job losses that the government's impact assessment describes, or you can take the 100,000 that Deutsche Bank have. But I think there's an aggregate cost question. More specifically, there's a question around the variation of contracts, and we can talk about that in more detail, but making sure that it protects against what we can probably call the P&O event, but equally allows things like if a restaurant moves from one premises on a high street to another, that contracts aren't accidentally novated. And then I think there are questions around how we manage union thresholds, which we need to think through in detail. So those would be my reds, but equally I've got ambers and greens here as well.
Give us a hint of the ambers, so it's important the committee knows where different sectors are concerned.
I think there's something around statutory sick pay which is worth considering. I think there's a tendency when we look at what a good job means to build around the paradigm of an office, and actually working in hospitality, not unlike, my wife's a nurse, working in a medical setting is just a different way of working, and we need to think about whether or not sick pay kicking in from day 2 might be more appropriate than day 1. Equally, I have an amber around notice of shifts and how we manage things like, let's say, major events at Ascot or Wembley or anywhere else. And you didn't ask, but I'll say anyway, I think green, I'm very supportive of changes in general to 0 hours contracts.
How many of the employees in the UK hospitality sector are currently on 0 hours contracts?
It's about 17% in total. If you were to look at who those people are, they are largely who you think they are. They'll be more likely to be students, they're more likely to be people with caring responsibilities. I think about my mum, who worked on what we would now call a 0 hours contract while she was raising me and my brothers. So that 17% is going to skew younger, it's going to largely skew female. And I think there's a really interesting question around making sure you have a legal structure which allows people who want to work flexibly to do it, but also making sure that people who want to work in a more settled, structured way, maybe because they have more responsibilities financially, to be able to do that as well. I broadly think the proposals in the bill are the right ones. I have a question about the reference period. I know Ireland has a 52-week reference period for estimating what is your set of regular hours. That possibly feels slightly too long. I've always held 26 weeks in mind as a number which allows you to cope with things like seasonal working, but equally allow the worker the right to choose whether or not they want to work flexibly or in a more fixed way.
Have you had any feedback from your members in terms of their willingness going forward to take the very people you've just talked about, employees with caring responsibilities, students, people who have, let's say, complex other situations in their lives, who find a 0 hours contract useful, that where some of your members may actually be now reticent to take people on in the new circumstances this bill would bring about?
Well, look, I come back to the point that you need the right legal structure, and I think it is legitimate that if somebody is in practice working 30 hours a week, say, regularly, and has been for the last year, for them to ask for that to be reflected in a different form of contract. I think that's absolutely right. It is worth saying that the data show, and it really doesn't matter how you look at this, the data show that most people on 0 hours contracts are happy with that. And in fact, if you advertise a 0 hours contract, you'll get more applicants. But to a degree, so long as it's in the gift of the employee to say, well, I'm working these regular hours and I want that reflected in a permanent contract, I think it's the right balance. But it is important that the government does, as it has, move its thinking to recognise that 0 hours contracts are a really important social fairness point, because they allow access to work for people who can't necessarily, and again, I come back to my mum when I was a kid, can't necessarily offer their employer set hours every week, and having that distinction in law is really important.
Mr. Carberry, if I can just come to you on this point of looking at those that you represent, what is it in this bill that you think is right, wrong, and needs amendment?
I won't repeat what Alan said about the aggregate cost of the bill, but clearly this is an enormous piece of legislation coming at a time when businesses, particularly consumer-facing businesses, have been through the pandemic, they're carrying more debt, they're struggling to drive the growth that the government wants. And I would say that amongst my members, as amongst many business organisations, the tone of the debate about the bill was changed by the budget, particularly the shift on the threshold, which pushes directly up costs of all of the people for whom maybe a hiring decision, a pathway is more marginal for an employer. So I think I'll just associate myself with Alan's comments on that. More specifically, for those who are not familiar with our sector places 1 million people into new permanent jobs every year, but placed 1 million people as temporary workers into workplaces today. So I come at this from the point of view of what do those people need and want to have good, positive, healthy working lives. Colleagues around the table may remember the attempt to change the conduct regulations to allow agency workers to replace striking workers, which we opposed because at the REC we believe in protecting temps and putting them in the right space. I think the most important thing for our sector is the proposal to apply the same tests on the same rules on 0 hours contracts to agency workers as to directly employed workers. I'll be really frank about this. We have been through there's a power in the bill, we have been through the consultation. We cannot see how any of the approaches in the consultation work for some of the reasons that Alan has set out. Agency workers are well protected. They benefit from their own act, the Employment Agencies Act 1973, their own set of conduct regulations, the 2003 conduct regs passed by the last Labour government, and they benefit from the agency workers regulations. There is a lot we can do to deliver the government's commitment to more certainty for agency workers. It's just not applying the powers in this bill. We fear that government is trying to avoid direct employers moving to agency to avoid the powers in the bill. A few direct employers doing that is not worth damaging the employment prospects of 1 million people. We cannot see how, for instance, if you are a supply teacher in a school, you have worked the summer term or worked the autumn term, say, to cover sickness absence, that person comes back from sickness, how giving that supply teacher a right to a contract from that school is good for the school or for the supply teacher, because we think that ultimately we'll just see a move to using more overtime, lengthening working hours of existing staff, and that will be net negative for the workforce. So I think there are things we can do on the 0 hours rules to apply to things we can do to protect agency workers. It's just not applying the proposals in this bill. More generally, I think our members would say that that feels a little undercooked in thinking. I think this is a very quick bill. I think there's quite a lot in the bill that if you talk to employment lawyers, if you talk to our members, they're looking at and thinking, how would that work? Classic example would be the collective consultation sections of the bill. I don't think it's in anyone's interest for large companies employing thousands of people to be stuck in perpetual collective consultation when they're shutting down one site with 20 people in it. So and that is just an example of some of the things that maybe need to work out, of course, through regulation. Lots of this is in regulation, but we just need to make sure that we're not putting up barriers to employment with this bill.
Minister.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Simpson, can I take you back to your traffic light, if that's all right? We'll go to Amber, if that's okay, because I think you mentioned the notice of shift as an issue in the Amber section. And I'm aware, I think, from the UK Hospitality Workforce Strategy, there's a general view that the hoteliers charter is a model good practice, which does require reasonable notice of shifts. So I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit more what your concerns are on this.
Yeah, so it's more about the unknown. I think reasonable, again, it's an important principle and there should be protections. I think that the challenge is going to be, and I noticed, by the way, that from what I understand from having read what is, again, a complex and lengthy piece of work, that the government is intending to leave to case law and employment tribunal systems to figure out what reasonable notice means. I think in general, different sorts of work it is reasonable to say there's a different version of what reasonable notice means. And, you know, just rhetorically, if I was going to go and work on a oil rig for 3 months, I want more notice of a change of shifts than if I was going to work in the local pub. So I think it's partly about figuring out what the right starting position for notice is. It's partly about reflecting differences in things like whether or not it comes with a residential element, say. There are questions around that. And then there are some practical things which I think will come out in the wash, but they do need to, around things like shift swapping. So what if two chefs say, do you mind covering Saturday because I want to go out with my friends or whatever it is? Yes, of course, that's fine. Is that allowed, or can that decision only be taken with that notice period? There's questions around things like, what if you put a message out saying there is a shift available, does anybody want it? Have you made an offer of employment to everybody you've put that message out to? Is there a time after which you're not allowed to do that? What if somebody, and one last thing, what if somebody agrees to move their shifts around? So you say on the Friday, do you mind coming in this Saturday and you can have next Saturday off? Yes, absolutely fine. Is that acceptable? So there are some practical questions, I think, around, first of all, the principle of there being different suitable notices of shifts depending on different forms of work, but also some practicalities which I'm sure are solvable around the management of it.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. I appreciate we haven't got much time, so I'll just ask one more question, if that's all right, for Mr. Carberry. Obviously, you pride your organisation on having members who, you know, absolutely comply with the standards set by law. Do you feel that the Fair Work Agency is going to be a good vehicle to help drive up standards, and is there anything in particular you would like to see it focus on?
Thank you, Minister. I think it's reasonably well noted that we were disappointed that an employment bill was not brought forward in the last Parliament. It is time to raise enforcement standards. I think one of the most common worries I hear about this bill, for which I will not hold you accountable, Minister, is the experience businesses have had of being the ones who comply and take on the on-costs. There are costs associated with this bill which are quite significant, and then watching people flout the law and not face enforcement. So a Fair Work Agency is a good idea. If I may, just a couple of guide points that we've heard from our members. One is we are great fans of the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate. We think they do excellent work as our regulator. They sometimes annoy the hell out of me, but that's what they're for. The team there are deeply expert, and in the creation of the Fair Work Agency, I would be, if you'll forgive me a Scottishism, scunnered if we lost that expertise. So maintaining expertise as we move into the FWA is really important, and that goes with properly resourcing the FWA and giving it the capacity to maybe draw down some of the claims that currently take 2 years to go to Employment Tribunal. And then the other thing, which is maybe a little bit more challenging, is that when we've done this in the past, success has been delivered by making these bodies of the labour market, not of the government. You go back to the 1970s, the Health and Safety at Work Act was guided into existence for its first two decades by the Health and Safety Commission. As a former Low Pay Commissioner, I will say that the Low Pay Commission, we hear a lot about businesses' views in the 90s of the minimum wage. They were against a minimum wage at £7.20 an hour in 1999. That's why it wasn't introduced. They were in favour of one at the introductory rate, which was developed by the Low Pay Commission. I would really like to see the FWA have that kind of tripartite guiding force to make sure that it's as much of us and our union colleagues as it is of the government.
Thank you. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Steve Darling.
Thank you, Mrs. Faz. My first question is to Alan, and I just really wanted to reflect on whether there's any differential around regional impact. Clearly, in London, we have a very vibrant economy, whereas in parts of the world, such as Torbay, where I'm from, in the West Country, it isn't as vibrant. Do you see any difference in regional impacts of this legislation?
Yes, I think so, but fundamentally because of the dispersed nature of hospitality, which is one of very few sectors which employ people everywhere versus other sectors which are much more clustered. It's a broader point I would make that we have a tendency to think of economics in terms of raw productivity, but actually there is the need to think about it in terms of social productivity and access to growth. My sector is one of a relatively limited number of sectors which provides a substantive route into careers, training and management for non-graduates around the country. Anything which has a asymmetric impact on my sector is going to have an asymmetric impact on the people that my sector provides employment for. And again, we saw this with the budget. We saw that NIC's increases are going to take away nearly half of the pay rises expected to lower earners, and maybe 20-25% of the pay rises expected for higher earners. And that will, of course, have the same sort of geographic footprint as you would expect.
Thank you. Then the second question is really to Neil, and I don't know if you're able to answer this question, so I'll listen with interest. It was looking from the perspective of people who may have a disability, whether it's a sensory, physical or learning disability. How could this impact on employment opportunities for those individuals?
Well, thank you for the question, and I regret it's not at the end. We're not at the end of your session today, because it would be lovely to meet Jenny. But let me reflect on the RAC's own experience. Over the past 2 years, we've placed 3,200 people through the government's Restart scheme into work from long-term unemployment, and many of them have faced barriers associated with disability. One of the things that agency work does, as Alan was reflecting earlier of the flexibility offered by hospitality, is it gives us a chance to do things a bit differently. It isn't 9 to 5 in the office, and obviously access to work is an excellent scheme, but it only goes so far. We've certainly seen, for instance, I'll give you an example from Birmingham, where we've placed a single father into work. His challenge was not his own disability, but he has a severely disabled child. The school to which the one child goes is on one side of the city. The mainstream school that the other child goes to is on the other side of the city. He can't do a 9 to 5. We've been able to place him into work on a flexible contract when he can work on a 0 hours contract, and that is creating some of the opportunities. So I think what's really important in this whole bill is to meet the workforce where they are, and they are somewhere different to where they were 10 or 15 years ago, and this need for flexibility is how people manage. My favourite example of this, just to round off, is we have a member who fills Christmas shifts for John Lewis up at Magna Park in Milton Keynes. It's 3,000 jobs every day between August and Christmas, making sure you get your Christmas presents. 10 years ago, they needed 3,500 candidates to fill those jobs because people got sick, they had a week off, obviously people didn't work 7 days a week. Now you need 12,000 candidates because people have greater choice, they're sitting at home, they're signed up to 5 or 6 of my members, they're taking the shifts they want, they're making sure that for instance, an example that we've used in our own Temp Work Works campaign, we have a temp worker who is managing a chronic illness. They're working in the ways that they can work. And if we think about the government's agenda today, I think embracing flexible work and agency work on that front as an enabler for people is really important.
Thank you.
So it's a question primarily for Alan at UKHospitality. How big of a challenge is retention in the hospitality sector? And do you agree with the Nationwide Caterers Association that one of the benefits of the measures in the bill around guaranteed hours would be to reduce staff turnover?
Yeah, I mean, so turnover is higher in hospitality than in many other sectors. Part of that is what you might call non-regretted turnover, i.e. it's people who are in hospitality for a period and then they maybe move on to their wider career, or they were a student, or as I say, somebody with caring responsibilities. There are also people who move on for other reasons. I would absolutely agree that for people who want to be on a fixed hours contract and are currently on a flexible contract, the ability to move from one to the other should help with retention. Yes, that seems absolutely true. Equally, there are other elements of this bill which provide a really suitable balance towards the worker, which will have exactly the same effect. I think the question is balancing that real value, and it is there, absolutely, against unintended consequences of, as Neil has sort of indicated, creating a hurdle rate, which means it's hard to bring people into the workforce. We saw today, I think it was today, there's 2.8 million people in the UK who are unemployed for reasons of health. This is a sector able to bring those people in, and we need to make sure both we are retaining and giving opportunities to people already in the sector, and we are providing access to the sector for that 2.8 million people.
Before you ask the question, we haven't got long now. There are other members indicating. So the question could be quick and the answers could be shorter too.
I think my concern is for people who are more at the margins of the labour market. You've touched on this a little bit. I think it's really important that we understand that employing anybody is a risk, and if you multiply the costs when things go wrong, then the risk may not be taken in the first place. In the hospitality sector, in my constituency, of which was quite a lot connected to horse racing, there's people are quite upfront about the fact that headcounts are going to fall as a result of this combined with the budget. But can you give us a bit of quant and qual, so an idea of some of the numbers that you think might not be employed as a result of these measures, but actually some sort of case studies, some examples of like hoteliers or whatever which might bring home the story.
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, the bigger impact was the budget. So whether you take the 50,000 government's number or the 100,000 Deutsche Bank's number, and I have no way to tell between those two things, so let's split the difference. There are certainly going to be job losses as a result. We should expect that those job losses will heavily weigh in on people who are on the minimum wage, because you can adjust the demand curve when you get to set the price of wages. You don't if the prices are set. So hospitality will bear a disproportionately large number of that for sure. If you want some qual, I was speaking to a publican who runs a series of pubs across the southeast. His net profits at the moment are about £300,000 across the set of pubs. He estimates that next year, on the same numbers ran with next year's costs, he'll lose about £60,000. So clearly, his judgment is exactly how much of that bears on raising prices, how much bears on him to reduce his profits, and how much bears on reduced salaries for the workers.
Next question, Alison Hume.
Thank you, question for you both. In 2023, there were 8,000 people working in the hospitality sector in the constituency I represent in Scarborough and Whitby. That's 20% of all employees, substantially higher than the average in the UK. In your view, does the bill's 0 hours contract clauses sufficiently cover for seasonal work, in your view?
From our point of view, it doesn't. I think Alan mentioned earlier the reference period. That's how you would allow for seasonal work to be properly reflected. And that balance struck between protecting the interests of workers in the East Coast's hospitality industry, but also protecting hospitality businesses who we know are often, as Alan set out, hard pressed. The reference period is absolutely key.
I recognise that. I said 26 weeks as a sensible reference period. I mean, Ireland's 52 reference period is probably longer than we need. But the clarity on exclusions around, fixed-term contracts and genuine casual work, I think, are material. And then there's something in the bill around where there is no work available after that period. It does need to be no or limited work, because you could have a business which is still open, but actually the number of people staying in the hotel, say, is materially down. So it needs to be possible to reflect those, and I think at the moment it doesn't. But that is, from my mind, a practical matter which doesn't affect the principles of what's trying to be achieved.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank both our witnesses for giving their evidence. We now move to the next panel. Good afternoon. We will now hear oral evidence from Jamie Cater's Senior Policy Manager for Employment at Make UK and Jim Bligh, Director of Corporate Affairs for the Food and Drink Federation. We have until 3 p.m. for this panel. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record? Jamie?
I'm Jamie Cater and I'm the Senior Policy Manager for Employment at Make UK.
I'll speak in English, sorry. I'm Jim Bligh. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs at the Food and Drink Federation. We represent thousands of businesses around the UK in the food and drink manufacturing industry in every constituency in the country.
Thank you. I call Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'll give you the same question I've given to most witnesses throughout the course of today. This is a thick bill. There's lots of measures in it. In the interests of those that you represent in food and drink and manufacturing, which of these measures do you think the government has got wrong? Which do you think are in the right ballpark that should be amended, and what's right?
Well, I think it's worth starting by saying that we welcome the underpinning principles of the bill. UK manufacturers are committed to providing good, well-paid work. We think that genuine exploitation and bad practice in the labour market should be addressed. And so we're supportive of a lot of what the government is trying to achieve through this legislation. There are specific measures that reflect policy recommendations that we as Make UK on behalf of manufacturers have made previously. For example, the extension of eligibility for statutory sick pay, making that an entitlement from day one of sickness, removing the lower earnings limit. We think that's the right thing to do, although we would like to see additional financial support for the smallest employers to help with the cost burden of that, a rebate scheme as there was during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our members also support some of the measures on things like equal pay, parental leave, and those family-friendly rights. In terms of the areas of concern for us, I'd list four. Two in the area of individual rights and two in relation to collective rights. On individual rights, we have some concerns around the detail of the implementation of the right to guaranteed hours. Some of that detail which will come forward in the secondary legislation around definition of regular working hours, the scope and the structure of the 12-week reference period for that right to guaranteed hours. And secondly, the structure of the statutory probation period, which will accompany the day right protection from unfair dismissal. On collective rights, the two areas where we have some concern, firstly around consultation requirements for collective redundancy and the impact that will have on businesses, particularly large businesses in our sector, just in terms of the extent to which they will be required to consult and the potential disruption associated with that. And then on dismissal and re-engagement or fire and rehire, where there is a very high bar set, we think it's right that there's a robust approach to that practice. We've supported previous measures like the existing code of practice, but we're concerned that the approach taken in this legislation might restrict the ability of employers to take action that they need to take, and that the way that measure is worded in the bill currently is too restrictive.
For us, we pride ourselves on being good employers of the 500,000 people around the country that the sector employs, and we simply wouldn't be able to feed our population of 70 million people without their commitment, hard work and dedication. We also know that a flexible labour market is the hallmark of a growing economy, and that's something that we're keen to protect. We're very receptive to a lot of the ideas in the bill, thinking about maternity and paternity provision, thinking about the pregnancy improvements there, the lower earnings limit for the statutory sick pay rules, which is a sensible thing now. We've moved away from that being a state benefit, and the recognition of the importance of flexible working, which our sector offers as well. We're also strongly supportive of a single enforcement agency. There are some areas which we'd like government to look at in a bit more detail and to consult fully with businesses in a way that follows best practice through 12-week consultations in particular. And we note with interest the Regulatory Policy Committee's concerns that it expressed yesterday in its analysis as well. There are 5 areas for us where we think government could work with businesses and with unions to come up with a pragmatic solution that will help meet both objectives. For us, they're around unfair dismissal and probation periods, collective redundancies, and a similar concern other witnesses have raised today as well. Some technicalities around 0 hours contracts and specifically definitions. Flexible working and the admin burden that poses for smaller businesses. Now the burden of proof is shifting, and some concerns around the secondary powers, which are quite wide-ranging for ministers, particularly on ballot thresholds. But broadly, we're receptive to the ideas in this bill, and we're looking forward to working with government to implement them.
We've heard from witnesses in previous sessions that they worry that some of the measures in this bill around 0 hours contracts, around some of the fire and rehire potential unintended consequences will make some employers more reticent to take on a new hire, to take a gamble on someone that perhaps needs a chance or a second chance or whatever it might be. Does that get reflected in either of your sectors?
Dismissal in the probation periods, that is a concern for us. Most of our sector uses 3 or 6 month probation periods now. So about 85% of our members have told us that's what they'll use. About 6% use 12 months. There would be a concern, I think, about a 9-month period, that reduction from 2 years. It's really critical that performance management from day one doesn't pose a significant burden on SMEs in particular. And it's really important that we keep that flexibility. If something's not right for the employee and not right for the employer, that performance isn't there, that quality standards or whatever aren't met, that there is a flexibility in terms of ending that employment relationship on both sides. What concerns us about the proposals in the bill is that young people or people re-entering the workforce, which rightly is a priority for government as well, I note that Liz Kendall is speaking on that in the House at the moment, we're concerned that they could be shut out through the changes that are coming through in this bill. Our proposal would be to revert to a 12-month probation period. Obviously, you automatically qualify for unfair dismissal on some elements. It's right that those elements are retained, but it's really important to us that you keep that flexibility from 12 months, that you have a light touch approach and a process there as well, but also that we have enough time to implement. What concerns us is that we're talking now about changes that will come in I think 2 years' time is a commitment from government. That time period is really welcome, but we aren't certain what the final provisions of the bill are. There is quite a long commitment to consultation, which we also welcome as well. Our proposal, Minister, would be that we implement 2 years after royal assent to make sure that there is that concrete security and guarantee, and the goalposts aren't shifted for employees and employers as they start.
Yeah, I would echo that and agree with those comments. I think for us, just sort of stepping back slightly and looking at the bigger picture, it's become very difficult for us with members to separate out the impact of the legislation and the impact of the autumn budget, the increase to employer NICs in particular, but in general the sort of tax burden on businesses. That taken together with the measures in the bill does increase the cost and admin associated with taking on people. There is a risk that that disproportionately impacts I suppose sort of people around the edges of the labour market. It's very welcome that the Work and Pension Secretary today is talking about how to reduce economic inactivity, particularly focusing on skills and health. We really support that focus, but there is a danger that the measures in the bill, and combined with that total cost impact, just make employers less likely, as you say, to take that risk on someone. Coming on in particular to protection from unfair dismissal in the statutory probation period, what we typically hear from members is that the usual approach would be to have, say, a 6-month probation period in an employment contract. They might then have a bit of additional flexibility for someone who is maybe a sort of borderline candidate, if maybe they need to be kept on probation perhaps for a bit longer, if they need a bit more skills training, a bit more experience, a bit of additional guidance in something before a firm decision is made about permanent recruitment. And so members often talk to us effectively about a kind of 6+3 model. So kind of a 6-month contractual probation period with the flexibility for an additional 3 months probation if perhaps there's a bit of uncertainty. So I think the government stated preference for a 9-month statutory probation period feels about right. It's probably the kind of the minimum. We wouldn't want to see it go any lower than that. The preference, I think, for us would be 12, just to give that additional leeway. But 9 months is probably about right in terms of what we would see reflected in standard practice from our members.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Mathers.
Good afternoon. I think you've generally been positive about the bill, albeit with some caveats. How do you see implementing this bill being of benefit to the businesses that you represent?
I think, to come back to the impacts of things like statutory sick pay, I think that will help with productivity, retention. We see a huge amount of feedback from member companies about their own investment in health and well-being, just the positive impact of that in terms of keeping people in work, helping with productivity, reducing presenteeism, and I think the measures on statutory sick pay will help with all of those things. Reducing long-term sickness absence, reducing presenteeism, improving people's productivity. So all of those measures I think are really positive. I think what we need to be careful of and what we're concerned about, and going back again to taking this alongside the impact of the autumn budget, is that it doesn't reduce or restrict employers' ability to continue to invest in all of those other things that also improve productivity. So we've heard concerns about impacts on training budgets, on internal budgets for things like occupational health and well-being, investment in technology and new machinery that can help workers to become more productive and more efficient. And so there is a risk that some of these sort of costs associated with the bill and the autumn budget mean that those investment budgets, internal investment budgets, get squeezed. So there is an opportunity through some of the measures in the bill to improve productivity, improve security for people in the labour market, but we need to make sure that some of those other measures are not undermining those benefits.
I'd agree with that as well. I'd endorse everything that Jamie just said. I think particularly the statutory sick pay clarifications are really helpful. The clarity on parental leave as well should be helpful too. And that importance of flexibility as well, ensuring that the flexible working practices that already exist widespread in our sector, and I know in the other sectors as well, are protected and are clear. But I do think there are concerns which potentially outweigh some of those benefits, which we're very keen to explore with government through the consultation periods.
Just one more question. You both talked a little bit about the statutory probationary periods, and so I think you were sort of more or less in the same place as us in terms of how long that should be, albeit it's a bit of argument either side. Can I take it from that you agreed that, as a matter of principle, removing the qualification period for unfair dismissal from 2 years is a good thing?
I think we would accept that you in your manifesto had a pledge to remove it from 2 years, take it back down. I think we're aware and we're grateful for the fact that government have moved it from day one up to 9 months. I think that's really important. But I think pragmatically we should look at a 12-month window instead, which worked well before and we think could work well again in future.
I think, this depends on I suppose the detail of what comes in secondary legislation and further consultation on exactly how that statutory probation period works. particularly that light touch process for fair dismissal during that 9-month period. I'd say from our perspective, sort of the lighter touch, the better. And businesses sort of want to know that they will have what they need in terms of following a correct process. I'm thinking about ACAS having the capacity to update things like their disciplinary and grievance procedures if and when there are claims going to an employment tribunal around unfair dismissal, that the tribunal system has the resources to deal with a potential uptick in the number of claims going through that system. So it's how that fair dismissal process works, following that consultation process, and then ACAS and Employment Tribunal, and both of those having the right resources to cope with that.
Thank you, Minister. Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Steve Darling.
Thank you, Mrs. Vaz. It's the same question for both representatives, and thank you for coming today. It's really my constituency in Torbay. It's relatively a world of small businesses mostly. Are there any reflections you have about the bill of how it could be improved to be more supportive around small businesses, please?
I want to come specifically on that to flexible working. Most of our sector, as I said, offer flexible working. I think most employers do generally, and they really see the benefits of that for employee engagement. And there are 8 reasons at the moment why you might reject a flexible working request, all of which are, or most of which are based on business need and quality and performance and so on. The concern with the proposal in the bill is that the burden has shifted to the employer to prove that business need. Now, that could be a real challenge for the smaller businesses to have to evidence that point. If you're a small business, as many of you will know from your constituents, it may well be that you're running the business, you're running the finances, you're running the sales, and you're running the HR. And this adds yet more process in to what should be a fairly simple system, and also a system that we know through the stats works. People will request flexible working, and very often that will be accommodated. So the concern for us there is that small businesses will be unfairly penalised on that front in particular.
I would agree with that, and come back to just the question of timing firstly, and I think it's helpful, as has already been mentioned, that there is a period during which not only there is further consultation for organisations like ours to feed into the details and feed in the views of small businesses who make up around 90% of manufacturing, but also that there is a period for businesses to be able to see what's coming, plan for it, and kind of make those preparations. So that period between sort of now and 2026, I think is really important. And I think generally, there is a role for government and organisations like ours who represent those businesses, but also provide support and advice to them, to work together just around the communications and making sure that people are aware of what the changes are, what they mean for them in practice. And for SMEs who might not have, HR directors, HR departments, access to lots of specialist support, just doing what we can together with government to make sure that businesses really understand what's coming, how they can comply, and how they can look at things like best practice to make sure they're ahead of the curve if maybe they need to be.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to ask you about the international dimension and thinking about manufacturing businesses that do have sites in other countries. I mean, Mondelez Cadbury in South Birmingham comes to mind. Amongst your members that do have that exposure to different systems of employment law and labour market regulation, I was just wondering whether you'd received any feedback on this bill from your members which is informed by that knowledge of different systems in practice.
To write to you with more details on this one, actually. We haven't had direct feedback from members. Very often the businesses that we work with in the UK, whether large or small, are the kind of the UK arm of that. So they'll operate their HR and their legal policies and all the rest of it in and from the UK for the UK market. But I'll go back to something I said earlier on, which is that flexible labour markets are the hallmark of growing economies, and it's also the hallmark of growing and productive food and drink manufacturing sectors around the world. And I think what global businesses would say about the UK is the UK has done really well on that front in recent years, and so wouldn't want to go any further backwards. I'd be happy to write to the committee with more information about international examples there after this.
I would just say there is some concern that's been expressed anecdotally from our members just around, I suppose, the sort of the competitiveness of the UK when it comes to manufacturing and the measures in this bill. I think there is a concern from member companies who might be headquartered elsewhere or have significant operations in countries outside of the UK, that it is becoming harder and more expensive and it's just more challenging to employ people in the UK. There is a lot of very welcome stuff that the government has done in terms of developing an industrial strategy that gives a lot more certainty and a lot more confidence for lots of businesses to invest generally in operations in the UK. But again, there is just when we think about the total cost of this bill, the administrative impact, the regulatory impact, I think there is a bit of concern that it is just becoming less attractive to employ people in the UK versus elsewhere. So that's something that we're increasingly having conversations with members about.
Thank you again. The impact assessment obviously says that the costs of the bill are around 5 billion, but earlier we heard that actually that's probably an underestimate and it's likely to be a lot higher. Could you tell us a bit about where those costs will tend to fall for your sectors in particular, and also how they will relate to other challenges that business are going to face with the national insurance rise, with the equalisation of the minimum wage, and with higher energy costs?
Yeah, I think in terms of those sort of upfront costs, there will be a lot that has to go into training, in particular for sort of HR managers, people managers, line managers, not just to ensure sort of regulatory compliance, but for employers who want to think about, just how their sort of broader culture and organisational culture reflects the principles of the bill. So there will be lots that sort of goes into ensuring compliance, lots that goes into sort of wider training of staff. I mentioned earlier that there was concern around the budget announcements in respect of NICs, and you mentioned living wage and minimum wage as well, that it may sort of become not only sort of more difficult to take the risk on employing people who might require additional training, but more broadly that training budgets might get squeezed. It's already very difficult, it's been made very challenging over recent years for our members to recruit the apprentices that they need, thinking about the apprenticeship levy and wider skills policy. The challenge, I suppose, is that those training budgets that are getting squeezed, that money effectively kind of goes increasingly into sort of training managers rather than necessarily going into the young people who need the kind of trade technical skills to work on shop floors and be working on production lines. So I think that is the risk, that it kind of further weakens an already unfavourable position that manufacturers are in when it comes to investing in the kind of technically skilled workforce of the future. I think that's where we see the real risk.
I agree with Jamie on all of that, and I'd probably add two more specific examples as well. There's the administration burden that I've mentioned, which particularly falls on small businesses, but really falls on all. And two examples of where that might come in. One is on the collective redundancy proposals for consultation, which remove the establishment, the single establishment. So if you're a large business with, say, 4 or 5 different sites, and you're making more than 20 people redundant in one of those sites, the way we read the bill is the expectation is you'd consult across all of those sites. I know previous witnesses have called this a perpetual consultation, and that is a concern that we have as well, that would be quite hard to manage. It's administratively really difficult to manage something like that across 5 different sites in a business. And it's also something that could lead to uncertainty and confusion amongst employees as well, who are being constantly consulted on restructuring and changes in other parts of the business and other local areas that have no impacts on them. So that's one. And I think the other point on 0 hours contracts, there is a risk that with a short reference period of 12 weeks, that you end up with not aligning with seasonal spikes in demand. So you end up paying people substantially more to do contracts that actually aren't required, given that doesn't reflect a full season. So our proposal, like others, is that's more reflective and closer to the Ireland model, and we suggest a 26-week reference period, so that does cover most elements of seasonality in a business.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm an MP from Edinburgh, and obviously that's a university city. It's a city with a lot of tourism and hotels and hospitality, and we also have the festivals in August, so we see a lot of this kind of stuff. And when I look around my constituency, I can see a real difference in how employers treat their staff. Some of whom will be really impacted by this legislation, but a lot of whom I don't think will be, because they're already above that. And I think, Mr. Cater, you've said a lot of your organisations that you represent already go beyond the provisions that are based in this law. So I wonder if you could tell us, do you think there's a potential that this legislation could lead to more of a level playing field, where the organisations that are already treating their staff quite well will be unaffected, but others will have to sort of change and improve their legislation, a kind of levelling up, if you like, in how people's staff are treated?
I think the important thing for levelling the playing field is the Fair Work Agency, and making sure that we have an approach to enforcement of labour market policy and regulation that is kind of properly resourced, and does have that level playing field. I said right at the start that we support efforts to remove and address genuine exploitation and bad practice in the labour market. And I think we have confidence that the Fair Work Agency can begin to do that. When we think about some of the concerns that we have in the bill, we've talked a lot about statutory probation periods, but on things like guaranteed hours and things like that, I think there is the potential to create a kind of level playing field, as long as we have the caveats that allow that kind of genuine two-sided flexibility where it works in the interests of both the employee and the employer. So retaining, for example, on 0 hours contracts, where they work for both parties, and in many instances they do, the employers and employees can still benefit from those arrangements. Some of the concerns that we have around the right to guaranteed hours are, as I say, in things like the definition of regular working hours, the scope, as Jim has alluded to, of the reference period, where we think there is a risk of an unintended consequence being that it captures a much broader range of flexible contracts than just, I suppose, kind of literal 0 hours contracts or low hours contracts. The example that we use in manufacturing is annualised hours contracts, where employees will be guaranteed a minimum number of hours over a 12-month period. They have much more sort of financial security in terms of pay, but those hours can still vary on a kind of week-by-week or month-by-month basis. We wouldn't consider that to be an example of, to use the words of the Plan to Make Work Pay, exploitative 0 hours contracts, but depending on where that 12-week reference period falls, depending on how you define regular working hours and what the number of those hours might be, a form of flexible employment like that could end up being in scope when actually maybe it's not appropriate to be. So we want to make sure that there's no unintended consequences where arrangements like that, which provide kind of financial security, stable employment, plus flexibility for both parties, that needs to be kept in place and not kind of unintentionally fall within scope of the measures in the bill, because that means that then it's not a level playing field. We're in a situation where good options for both parties are effectively being taken off the table.
For me, this is about enforcement and having a really well-resourced, strong enforcement agency and making sure that people are aware and that they can be supported to comply, and then the enforcement and fines and so on come after that. But that's about having a really well-enforced system. I think it's also about making sure that, on the other side of it, that the employment tribunal system can cope. And that's a really important part of enforcement. If you think at the moment, at best, we have 6-month employment tribunal delays and at worst 2 years, then that is an area of the system I think we need to look at.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time for the allotted questions. Can I thank the two witnesses very much for their evidence, and we now move on to the next panel. Thank you. Everyone ready? We will now hear oral evidence from Gemma Griffin, Vice President of Global Crewing for DFDS, Martyn Gray, Director of Organising for Nautilus International, and Mick Lynch, General Secretary of RMT. We have until 3:40 for this panel. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gemma Griffin. I'm the Vice President and Head of Global Crewing for DFDS, who are a pan-European, Mediterranean, African ferry and logistics organisation. I'm based in Dover, where we operate quite a number of vessels between UK and France. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Martyn Gray. I'm Director of Organising at Nautilus International. We're an international trade union and professional association representing 20,000 maritime professionals, primarily in the UK, Netherlands and Switzerland.
Hello, Mick Lynch, General Secretary, RMT. We're a majority railway union, but the M is for the maritime sector, and we organise the ratings as opposed to Martyn's officers. That's the way the world works. The seafarers around the world, or less around the world these days, but mainly in the ferry sector and offshore energy, where we have crew service vessels too.
Thank you. I call Greg Smith, Opposition spokesperson.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the witnesses. As any wide-reaching piece of legislation that's seeking to make a number of changes to employment law comes in, there's likely to be unintended consequences. So perhaps I could phrase the question in two halves, particularly to Ms Griffin and Mr Gray. Do you see any unintended consequences that could damage your businesses, make you less likely to take on new staff? And to Mr Lynch, I suspect may come from the other side of the argument on this. Do you think this bill goes far enough?
I think just to make it clear that we're talking about seafarers, so the shore-based colleagues that we have in our organisation is not what I'm here to represent today. So as it stands today, I believe, and my learned colleagues beside me have more experience on shore-based stuff, but I don't believe that our seafarers are currently covered by the Employment Rights Bill. And my understanding is that there's an opportunity today to talk to your good selves about ways or mechanisms by which we may be able to enshrine something for seafarers that they can actually be afforded similar rights and opportunities as shore-based workers. I think the key point in the current bill was, I think, related to this is the fire and rehire right, where this kind of... and that's the sort of stuff that we're very pleased as DFDS that you will be banning, and I hope that it does indeed actually refer to seafarers as well, right? Because for us, that I guess that's the biggest concern amongst many others that we would have as an operator who are simply looking for a fair and level playing field, particularly when we talk about the Straits of Dover, whereby you're moving from territorial UK waters straight into French territorial French territorial waters, and no international waters, whereby one might use the normal ways of international seafaring legislation. So we're really hoping that we can capture some of the things that we believe our seafarers are at risk of losing if we don't extend it to seafarers in whatever way we can. Say again?
Your ports-based staff, your land-based staff?
Our land-based staff are already covered.
Yeah, but to the question on the unintended consequences of elements of the bill.
Do I see any unintended consequences for our land-based employees? No is the answer, because we're very much trying to create a situation where our colleagues have rights and that are treated fairly. And I think the most important thing is that there's a level playing field, and whoever we're operating in the same space, that the law applies to them. And if we're all UK based and have UK contracts, then I would imagine that would be the case. But my area of expertise, just to make it clear, is actually seafarers. I'm not really involved on the UK side, so I don't want to overreach and maybe show my absolute ignorance in that respect. I apologise.
Mr. Gray?
Just to clarify, I am a director of organising for a trade union, so I'll answer from the perspective of, does this go far enough? If that's... Thank you. No, is the very short answer to that. It needs to go further in terms of protections for those who are working at sea. There are still monumental gaps in the protections that are afforded to seafarers compared to the protections that are afforded to land-based workers, even under existing employment legislation. And those gaps still need to be closed up. This comes some of the way to addressing some of the challenges that we would have seen in the wake of P&O Ferry's decision to terminate without notice and without consideration 786 people in March 2022. But it still does not go far enough to place the rights and protections of those who are working at sea on a parity to the rights and protections of those that are working in shore-based roles and with shore-based employment contracts. More still needs to be done, and more can still be done that will allow for greater protections for those that work at sea to be delivered, that's fully within the remit of this Parliament to be able to legislate for.
Okay, yeah, from my point of view, I don't think there'll be unintended consequences. I hope the intended consequences go far enough, but maybe we'll have to have more legislation going through. We had lots of legislation against the unions under previous government, and so hopefully we can get more legislation in favour of workers and their organisations. It doesn't go far enough, I don't think, but we can improve it, I think, during this process. One of the things we'd like to see is the power for trade unions to get redress, injunctive power against people like P&O, which was never considered. We were told that if we took action against P&O, and there was a slim possibility of it, we could be liable for all of their revenue loss every day of their trading, which could have been up to £15 to £20 million a day. So that's impossible for workers and their organisations to take forward. And what you've got to remember about P&O is they deliberately broke the law to get rid of their workforce and to undermine good shipping companies. So we've got an employer such as P&O and Irish Ferries working out of our ports that undermine good businesses. And I think I just caught the end of the previous session, that it was hoped that there'd be a lifting of all boats, to use that pun, but to create a playing field that is fairer. It will never be completely level, I don't think, but it would be fairer on all the good businesses in Britain that are working, British businesses and working in Britain, to make the pirates, what we consider P&O to be, come up to the standards of everyone else that's doing business here. Treat their workers well, treat the environment well, treat their passengers well. If you're doing all of those things, you will run a successful business despite a marginal increase in overhead. And let's not forget that people like P&O are dramatically resourced by the richest people on the globe. And they deliberately took that step to exploit our laws, as poor as they were, left to us by previous governments, because they knew they'd get away with it. And what they've got to be aware of in the future is they will not get away with it without consequences for their business and for their reputation. Unfortunately, the previous government has allowed them to shed their skin, leave it behind, along with all those people they made unemployed, and carry on as if nothing has happened. And that's a shame on all of those people that allowed them to do that.
Do you have any views on the trade union facility time provisions of this bill?
Not particularly. We make arrangements with our employers. We have private sector employers and public sector employers. We do that through collective agreements, and I imagine that we will always create decent arrangements with all of our employers, whether they're road transport, rail or maritime, about appropriate release for our people. So that's not a thing that concerns us overly at this time.
That's great.
No particular concerns in relation to the way facility time seems to be structured in that. I think it overall will prove to be beneficial. I know that there are some in the trade union movement that would like to see more on that. But again, I think with the sort of maritime aspect and the practicalities of working around that, it is helpful in terms of what is being proposed in the bill. Thank you.
And from your perspective?
No problem. From our perspective, we see both RMT and Nautilus here as partners in our endeavours to do the right thing for our people. So, full support.
Right.
Obviously, we were all horrified at the way people were treated by P&O, and I think we share your critique that the previous government's response to that was not sufficient. Clearly, we are trying to address those issues in the bill. Do you feel that this is going to be a good deterrent against employers basically calculating a financial issue as a way of trying to avoid their legal obligations on consultation?
Yep. Well, I'm hoping it will be, Minister. I'm hoping that bad employers will have to think twice about being badder again in P&O's terms. And I've got to emphasise, we were on good terms with P&O. We were negotiating, both unions, their new vessels, and they deceived us deliberately, took legal advice that rather than negotiate with us the new technology vessels that were coming in, they'd rather sack all their people and break the law and use security guards to get our people out. So with good enforcement, with a powerful agency that knows what it's doing and has got a clear remit, and the right deterrence, and I think that goes into company law in some ways. I don't think any of those people were worried about being disbarred as directors, being fit or proper persons and all the rest of it. And I don't think they were worried about their profits being affected by any fine that they would get. As it happens, I don't think anything's happened to them at all. So as a director, you've got to think about whether I'm going to pay my VAT, whether I'm going to pass on the national insurance, whether I'm going to pay the rates and all the bills from my suppliers. You should be thinking about what the consequences for you are in employment law and other laws related to employment, and think very seriously if you're going to deter it. But we have got to have the power as trade unions, as representatives of the workers, to intervene where we know they're breaking the law. And that is a real shortcoming. The power is all with the employers. They can injunct me personally, they can injunct my trade union, they can close us down for making clerical errors on ballots, just misnaming or misbranding the grades in a dispute. And they will do it if they get any chance. We have no power to injunct them on behalf of our members, it seems. So I think that needs to be considered, that the Fair Work Agency and its enforcement powers should be at the level of injunction to stop these rogues getting away with it in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd also add that what's quite helpful in terms of the bill is the removal of vessels being treated as individual establishments. That's particularly helpful when it comes to redundancy consultations. And indeed what we saw with previous case law, with previous legislation, with the case of Seahorse Maritime versus Nautilus International versus Seahorse Maritime, that was a particular case where it was proven that each individual vessel had to be treated as a single establishment, which removed the right for operators with significant GB links anyway in those particular circumstances, that being able to circumvent the need to consult with recognised trade unions on what amounted to mass redundancies. There were more than 20 people being made redundant from that particular employer, but they were able to circumvent that because each individual vessel was treated as a single establishment. Now, that is a real helpful feature of the Employment Rights Bill that's coming through, and something that I think should be celebrated and praised with that. That is going to be very helpful in us being able to defend our members' rights and hold companies to account for their responsibilities when going through redundancy process, we're going through collective consultation on business restructuring and organisations. Linking that to P&O ferries, it wouldn't have made a difference with that, as each of the P&O ferries establishments was more than 20, so there would have been a requirement for the collective consultation anyway, and indeed 2 out of the P&O ferries operations would have been more than 100 people, so it would have required slightly lengthier consultation periods under the legislation. But this is going to be helpful in wider maritime context for those where there are smaller numbers of seafarers engaged in actually being able to defend their rights and interests and really hold a company to account over the need for making those redundancies, as well as with the change to fire and rehire. That's quite helpful as well in terms of the support in businesses needing to demonstrate a clear and identifiable need instead of seemingly being able to operate on a whim.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that, and I think, you know, talking about significant ties to the UK, this is really something that you have to keep in your mind, because it's very often in shipping that there's a myriad of different employers based outside of UK. For example, flag of the vessel can be, you know, in many cases EU or UK, whatever. But I think when you look at the Straits of, you know, the Dover Straits, we DFDS, yes, okay, we have UK flag, we also have French flag, but our vessels are doing 42 sailings a day in and out of Dover port every day, up to 54 then in the summertime. Other operators are doing more or less the same. If that's not a clear link to the UK, then I'd like to know what is. It's not the same as one sailing every day out of, you know, a longer port in the North Sea. And I just think that my fear as a you know, an operator who, you know, hold our seafarers in good stead and as the absolute backbone of our organisation. And for me, I would like to be able to see that there's a way of capturing that in the UK law, and that we won't find yet another loophole of the flag state, you know, being responsible but doing nothing, and then the port state, in this case being UK, wanting to do something and not capable of doing it. That sounded like a bit of a riddle. I do apologise.
No, it's all very very useful. Thank you. Just something to pick up on something you said earlier, Mick, but others can answer as well if they want. You talked about injunctive relief as being a potential solution to dealing with the threat of fire and rehire. Obviously, we're consulting at the moment on measures including interim relief as a potential action that unions could take on behalf of the members. Could you just explain a little bit about why you would prefer injunctive relief as a solution rather than interim relief?
Well, interim relief, it can take time, and I'm not convinced that tribunals will have the power and have the kudos to achieve it. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, as you know, Minister, but what I want is the ability for the unions to make an intervention on behalf, and it'll have to be based on law and something that the company has done wrong. But it seems to me that injunctions are immediate and carry the weight of a higher court. When we get injuncted under the anti-trade union laws, it's at a high court and it's immediate, and there's no doubt about the effect of that injunction. If you want to defy it, it's on your head for your organisation, whether it's a trade union or a multinational company. So I do feel that if it's not called injunctive relief, I don't mind whatever way the bill comes out, as long as it's got the power of immediacy and enforceability through proper channels. That's what we want to see. We don't just want a slap on the wrist and then the company factors that in. You know, you've added another £10,000 to the fine, And if you're sacking 2,000 people, you don't really care. What we want is for them to be forced to stop the activity subject to the full force of the law, not just a minor blip on a spreadsheet. That's what we want to see. Whether it's called an injunction, interim relief, I don't mind. If the tribunals are beefed up so that they can do that, that's fine, because that can be a good channel as well. I'm open to suggestion on that, but I hope we get the power to do it.
Anyone else want to respond on that? Martyn, yeah?
We've spoken about unintended consequences, but I think an intended consequence of this is about addressing an imbalance between the rights of employers and the rights of employees in the UK, the rights of workers. And as a trade union, we are subject to such higher bars and thresholds when it comes to being prevented from being able to enforce the rights of our members, being able to enforce the rights of workers in standing up for what is right and what is appropriate and what is fair. So to have a mechanism where an employer can be held to the same scrutiny in the same account and have the same preventative measure, that same preventative immediacy of that measure, without the consequences that we would have to face in terms of that, because employers don't face the consequences if that injunction is granted and it then turns out to be something that isn't fair or appropriate or is done on appeal. That's just dealt with. So I think it's about fairness, it's about it being appropriate, and it is right that unions can make interventions on behalf of the members that they represent and make those interventions without needing to worry about having to put significant amounts of members' money at risk, should that then turn out to be something that needs to be resolved at a later date. Unions tend not to pick those particular fights and arguments without having first looked very carefully at what is within the realms of the law and not. So it is a case of it would be extremely unusual that that mechanism would be abused should it be granted. And I think it's really important that the intended consequences of placing the rights of workers and the rights of employers and trying to increase the rights of workers to a point at which they can actually address some of the imbalance in that is supported with this, and that would be a real big help in being able to defend the rights of workers.
Can I,
yes,
and I do agree with that, and I have to say that but the very nature of the thing is that employers and organisations are larger than employees, and if the employees are not able to collect themselves to a sum total where their voices can be heard, then they have no chance. And there's something fundamentally wrong in this day and age that a union agreement can just be put to one side and actions taken, and just completely and utterly taking the voice away from your employees. And I just think when we look at how the United Kingdom operate on an international level, we're quite happy to sit with the unions and with employers together to negotiate at ILO level and at IMO level and all of this. But when we come home into our own shores, then no, those rules don't apply. So whatever, the unions are not the enemy to our organisation. And again, it's a really poor message that we're sending out, saying that, people who do the right thing, an organisation like DFDS, who recognise the employees' rights, but are actually disadvantaged, because before we sell a single ticket to a passenger, we are already hugely more costly than our operators in the same field. But we make the choice to start a race to the top instead of joining that race to the bottom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'd like to just put a personal perspective. I feel that unfair employment laws can often fan the flames of tribalism, and I look at over the way at Europe, where there is a more consensual approach and more a collaborative culture. How do you see this bill could drive a more collaborative culture with employers and unions?
Well, if it makes us come to the table and people feel, and some employers, some employer groups even feel that they're not exempted from collective arrangements, that will be better. I mean, some people won't like this, but in the 70s we had 82% of workforce covered by collective bargaining. It's now 20%. Now, and there's arguments about that, and I don't want to relive the last 40 or 50 years, but it's clearly too low. The ILO, the IMF, all sorts of bodies are saying that the lack of collective arrangements is forcing this race to the bottom. But it's not just workers that get pushed to the bottom, it's these businesses that get pushed to the bottom as well. And people are now bidding on contractual margins that are completely unrealistic. I hear it from some of the clients I go into. So when I'm talking about contract cleaners, contract caterers, all sorts of people, they know that the people that are bidding for the business cannot make a margin, even a reasonable margin, 2% maybe. You'd be hoping in a business you'd be getting 5 and 10 and maybe even better. But people are knowing that they're underbidding other people because that's the poor state of employment law that we've got. But it's also because we haven't got sectoral collective bargaining. Now, we had the previous speakers here from the Engineering Employers Federations, they used to be called, used to run a massively collectively bargained sector in this industry. If we had that, I think we'd have better arrangements all round and people would not be allowed to go rogue. Now, I'm hoping there will be some provision for that in the law so that all employers will know whether I'm working on a construction site or on the high seas or running a window cleaning business or whatever I'm doing, I cannot go below a certain level and there'll be no sweatshops in the future and there'll be no mass exploitation. And the trades unions must have a say in that. They must have a say even in non-union sites. And that's what we used to get. The big firms used to set the trend and the perspective of where an industry should be, and many smaller businesses voluntarily followed the union agreement. And they weren't just union agreements, they were industry agreements. And I think we have to get back to some idea of that the industry stands for this. But many of those employers' federations have broken up now. They don't even feel they need to speak to the trade unions. And in the future, I hope this bill brings a lot of voluntary recognition so that many workers, certainly more than 50%, are covered by collective arrangements in one form or another. And the EU wants 80%, by the way, for those of you that are still hankering after that. That's the new measure.
I believe it was the early 90s, the last time the National Maritime Board met, which used to undertake sectoral collective bargaining between the shipping industry and between the maritime trade unions, which would have then been both of our predecessor organisations, and the UK Chamber of Shipping, which would set an establishment of the rates of pay, which both unions would then take away to individual employers and build upon. The situation exists elsewhere in the world. In the Netherlands, my colleagues and my team are negotiating at the moment for the Merchant Navy agreement-wide that sits for the Merchant Navy equivalent in the Netherlands for commercial shipping. They're negotiating that as we speak. They're undertaking negotiations with ship owner representatives and them as representatives as the seafarers, and they are setting what that standard looks like in the Netherlands for the minimum increase, and then we work with other employers to build on that with what we can do. It sets the minimum standard. So for you know, the envisagement of what sits within this, sectoral collective bargaining is going to be key. And indeed, we see a start of that through the element of fair pay agreements as they're coming through with that. But sectoral collective bargaining really is going to help deliver the biggest gains, the biggest partnership between unions, between employers, as it should work and as it does work in many instances in maritime. And it's going to be crucial for solving one of the biggest challenges that the UK faces at the moment, which is the productivity crisis. Actually working together to solve that is going to be done through not only sectoral collective bargaining, but through just talking about how industry works. Unions, the workforce, those in the industry, the experts in that industry, and should be setting that standard as to what it looks like and working together to improve that and to generate those productivity gains, because everybody benefits when the productivity increases. Workers have better pay, better conditions, employers, better profit, better operations, better certainty. It's win-win.
We operate in a number of countries that have sectorial agreements like this: France, Denmark, Netherlands. So again, it does set the level playing field for all competitors, and you know that there's a rate of pay that's fair and that everybody else is paying, and then you can focus on just doing business.
Thank you. Is that it, Mr. Darling? Yeah. Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to refer once again to the most high-profile case that we've seen of fire hire in recent times when P&O unlawfully sacked 800 workers, many of whom were your members and were impacted by that. At this morning's evidence session, Matthew Percival from the CBI said that fire and rehire proposals in this bill risk making redundancy easier than negotiating contract changes. Do you agree?
No. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, defending fire and rehire, or fire and replace, is what P&O was. There's two versions of it. Is defending the immoral. Maybe the CBI knows a thing or two about immoral behaviour. I don't know, but I don't know why they would be standing up against that. We negotiate contract changes all of the time, and the great problem with P&O, they deceived us. They told us that they were going to negotiate change for new technology, new vessels, new ways of working. There probably would have been some job losses, I understand, and we would have dealt with that under normal process. They decided to sabotage that because it was quicker, and they wanted to get imported foreign labour onto those vessels at £4 and £5 an hour rather than a collective agreement. So I don't see good employers struggling with that. I don't see decent businesses struggling with negotiating contract changes, staffing level changes, new technology agreements, which we're all going to need right across business. And indeed, we will talk to DFDS about that, hopefully in the near future, and Stena and all the other good shipping companies. We're talking about it on the railway. Every trade unionist that will come in front of any of you will say, we're constantly negotiating change. At the end of the Second World War, my union had 500,000 members. The railway employed 1.2 million people. That has obviously changed. We had sectoral collective bargaining all through that, and most employers had never heard of fire and rehire. You can retool an economy inside collective arrangements. Our European partners have shown us that if you refit your economy based on consensus and change and looking after people that have to leave, you'll get a more successful business. If you just guillotine the whole process, your reputation is going to be in ruin. So I don't accept the CBI's position. They were probably against the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Sex Equality Act. All of these acts have brought impacts on business, and no doubt the Factories Act was a bit burdensome for the mill owners and the mining companies of this country. Everything is difficult for a business, but you've got to live inside the regulations in a democracy, and that's what it should be about.
I suppose to some extent it's the difference between doing what's easy and what's right. And, you know, it's disappointing that there is an attitude amongst some elements of business in this country that they are opting to do what is easy as opposed to doing what is right. Negotiating with trade unions is fairly straightforward. And indeed, P&O Ferries, using that example, in 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, we negotiated redundancies with P&O Ferries as they reduced their operations and went through that process. So short of Mr Hebblethwaite not wanting to get back round the table with us, because we did hold them to account over their business proposals in 2020, we did make sure that the redundancies they were making were absolutely necessary, were to right-size the business. We did feedback on all of their proposals, and we engaged very heavily in that process in 2020 when we went through 2 rounds of redundancies with that particular employer, to then have them say, we wouldn't have been able to engage with what they were proposing because they know what they were proposing was wrong, morally reprehensible. To wipe out a long-standing, collectively bargained workforce, offering quality jobs, employment, training opportunities in, you know, across many deprived coastal communities, jobs that are still, losses of jobs that are still being felt in Kingston upon Hull, still being felt in Birkenhead, still being felt in Liverpool, still being felt in Dover, those loss of jobs. For them to be able to say, actually, because what we were suggesting was so wrong, we just decided to push ahead and do it anyway, knowing that there would be limited repercussions for that, is to some extent why we're here talking about it, because it highlighted just how easy it was for business to make the wrong decisions. So to have the CBI not recognising that those easy options are what's putting us in this position, where regulation is being needed and needed to be developed, is, you know, it's shocking, it's abysmal, but unfortunately, it's not that surprising. I disagree with what he said. I disagree that this would make it the preferred option to go through a redundancy, to go through fire and rehire, than to go through and engage with trade unions. Because negotiating with trade unions, we understand the business operations and we can help, and we have helped. Because the number of redundancy consultations that I've been engaged with employers in maritime, where we've been able to look at things differently, where we've been able to support what it is that they're going through, where we've been able to talk about the number of redundancies that are potentially being needed to be made, and support building jobs back in, support plans for growth, support changes to terms and conditions that's protected jobs, negotiated our way through that for the betterment of the business and the people that it employs, is countless at this point. So for the CBI to have that approach, for some business elements to have that approach, that it's easier to fire and rehire, it's easier to put that through instead of negotiating, it's really short-sighted and really problematic for the future.
So I'm going to try and get 3 more members in 5 minutes, but would you like to respond to that?
Jobs either exist or they don't. It's very black and white for me. I have to be quite honest with you, So for me, fire and rehire is always a bit of a horror story, and particularly when you look long term and the skills and the intelligence that the people have on your operation and how to work. So for me, there's always another solution. So that would be my point of view.
Thank you. Chris Law.
Focusing still on fire and rehire, and just listening to the comments made in the last 5 minutes, I think it's consensus is we want to see the end of fire and rehire, and I completely support that. However, when you look at the detail of the bill, there could well be a loophole within this, so let it continue. There is a section which says that there is an exception for those in financial difficulties, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that. For example, who defines what the financial difficulties are, and who decides around that, and how that's to be negotiated? Because for me, using the term financial difficulty is actually a loophole for any employer to say, well, actually, we're going to have to let go in this circumstance. Do you agree with that, or do you think more work needs to be done on it?
I think we have to be very careful. Because companies are very good at creating entities that are subsidiaries of subsidiaries that are based in other jurisdictions, and all sorts of measures that are far too complicated for a simple soul like me. I'd like the reporting of a business to be very straightforward. Everyone will know whether a business is failing. And fire and rehire for a failing business is not going to work in many instances. Certainly on shoreside, it's likely that the business will fold before such measures can be brought. And of course, it's very difficult to do what P&O did, because it relies on bringing people from overseas to replace. I mean, Grant Shapps said last year, or the year before, that he was going to replace all the railway workers in Britain at one stage. So there was actually a government minister promoting fire and rehire during our dispute. So I think we've got to be very careful not to allow loopholes. I know that accountants and auditors are very good at creating these loopholes, but as far as possible, it's got to be plain for the layperson to see whether a business is struggling and has genuine business needs to get any hint of an exemption, and they should be very rare indeed if they are to exist.
Quite simply, if directors can sign off the business as still remaining as a going concern, then I think quite simply that fire and rehire shouldn't be an option for that. And I think if you're looking at a scenario where directors are quite happy to say, under companies legislation, that it's a going concern, but we need to do a complete restructure, strip away the employment rights, strip away the benefits, strip away working conditions, things that have been long thought over many years of negotiation, or long thought over many years of discussions, all the benefits that sit within those employment contracts, and strip them back to minimum, then they shouldn't really be in a position, that business isn't in a position where they can consider itself a going concern. So I'd set a really high threshold of that, and then allow for there to be scrutiny from that, from the relevant bodies, and if it turns out that actually that could have been avoided, fire and rehire in those scenarios, then it's quite clear that those directors shouldn't actually have gone through that, and then there must be consequences for it. So I think there's probably room for improvement, some tweaks and changes, but I'd put it quite simply.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, a classic example of this that I can give you is that during COVID, overnight, 80% of our business was gone, and we had vessels that are worth a lot of money and a lot of crew. And you know, of course, there was the inevitable discussions on, you know, redundancies or just stop or what's going to happen. We made a deal with both Nautilus and RMT at the time that we would work on this together, because, you know, we were hoping things would come back, and it was only in year 2 that we really had some sense that things would come back. But one of the things that we did was collectively go out to our workforce and say, look, it's these jobs versus how about if we work together and we do a pay freeze for the 2 years, and we just take that pain together so that we can have the jobs at the end of it. And we did that together. And there, you know, if something's going to go bust, it's going to go bust. But if there's a way of, you know, keeping the money in a better way, we suspended training, non-essential stuff, we made operational changes. I think it's, you know, it's too easy to leave it in as a loophole, because if you really, it's like you're just taking the profits out of the pockets of your people, is that loophole for me. So I think we need to be careful there.
Bedford.
Mick, earlier you mentioned that you felt that there should be further legislation which suggests that this bill is falling short. Could you elaborate a bit further on what you'd like to see the government do if this bill is falling short?
What we would like is very straightforward, that there is going to be provision, amendment for sectoral collective bargaining. If there is proper sectoral collective bargaining across the economy, then many of the issues that people are dealing with as individuals, individual rights, which they have to enforce for themselves in many cases, will be dealt with. So there's a lot of discussion about probation. We have probation agreements with every employer that we deal with, and we don't defend people who are incompetent or incapable. We have a process, and if we've got sectoral collective bargaining, all of those things will be covered.
That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank all our witnesses for their evidence. We now move to the next panel. We will now hear oral evidence from Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC, Maggi Ferncombe, Director of Political Strategy and Transformation for UNISON, Dave Moxham, Deputy General Secretary of STUC, and Hannah Reid, Co-ordinator of Constitutional Affairs for Unite. We have until 4:30 for this panel. So could I ask the witnesses, please, if you could briefly introduce yourself for the record. Paul.
Yeah, my name is Paul Nowak. I'm the General Secretary of the TUC. We represent 48 unions, 5.3 million workers right across the economy in the UK.
I'm Maggi Ferncombe, Director of Political Strategy and Transformation for UNISON. UNISON is a public sector union representing 1.3 million members.
My name is Dave Moxham. I'm Deputy General Secretary at the STUC, which is the independent but sister organisation to the TUC in Scotland.
And I'm Hannah Reid. I'm Coordinator of Constitutional Affairs at Unite. Unite has a membership of well over 1 million members. We represent members across a wide range of sectors, including manufacturing, food, transport, and also services, including health, local authorities and hospitality.
Mr. Gregson.
Thank you, Mrs. Vaz. Good afternoon. To the witnesses. In the last session, it was suggested that this bill might lead to the reunionisation of the economy. Do you agree with that?
Maybe if I could start. I think this will be the biggest upgrade to workers and trades union rights in a generation. I think it is very likely that we will see increased unionisation as a result of the bill, and I think that that would be a good thing. I mean, there are bodies as disparate as the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, that have talked about the benefits of unions and collective bargaining in modern economies, benefits in terms of improved productivity and business performance, but benefits also for workers in terms of increased pay, better access to things like skills, more equal and fair workplaces. I don't think there's a direct link between you don't pass a piece of legislation and trade union membership and collective bargaining goes up, but I think the repeal of the 2016 Trades Union Act, the repeal of the Minimum Services Level legislation, the Strikes Act, and other measures in the bill will help unions to organise, and that will be good for employees and good for workers, but good, I think, for employers and good for the UK economy as well.
I'm in with the impact assessment, which we equally heard at a session this morning, representatives from business suggesting was actually a lowball estimate, suggesting that this is going to be a £5 billion cost to business. How do you work out that that might lead to increased wages if the cost on business is in fact going up?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to put that £5 billion into a figure. That's something like 0.4% of the overall wage bill. The TUC's published research today. Again, very sort of moderate estimates because in the government impact assessment they talked about potential benefits to the economy from this bill in terms of things like improved staff retention, improved productivity, bringing people back into work who are currently outside the labour market, 900,000 people or so, less in the labour market now than there was before the pandemic. A very moderate estimate, we believe that will generate £13 billion for the UK economy. And there will be undoubtedly, for a small number of employers, increased costs. If you don't pay sick pay from day one at the moment, if you do use 0 hours contracts, it may well cost you more. Those benefits will transfer directly to low-paid, insecure workers. And I think it's really important to make the point that most employers do not use 0 hours contracts. Most workers in this country are entitled to sick pay from day one. What this bill does is level the playing field for those good employers who at the moment I think are in danger of being undercut by those who play more fast and loose with the livelihoods of their workforce.
Thank you. From UNISON's perspective, it does mean that in certain sectors, workers are no longer going to be dispensable. There are some real perilous conditions out there for some of our workers, and we all know that valued workers that are paid a good salary have better security at work, are more productive. For our sector, obviously, it's around the public service. It's better for service users, it's better for society, and it's going to be better for economy.
I'll be brief. We have a productivity problem in Scotland and across the UK, and that is largely because workers are not, either collectively or individually, being sufficiently engaged, sufficiently consulted, and sufficiently used in terms of driving productivity and driving success within their own workplaces. And trade unionism, in my experience, helps with that. We are day and daily inundated with problems in workplaces which are not unionised, which have to be dealt with in other ways. The Employment Tribunal is full of these situations. Our experience, and it's long held, is that trade unionised workplaces actually avoid those problems. We are fortunate, I would say, in Scotland, and it's not perfect, to have already a government which recognises that collective bargaining, that fair work is a driver for success, and I very much hope that this bill will add strength to that for us, but also see that approach reflected across the whole of the UK.
Thank you very much for the question. We obviously here today represent working people. That's what trade unions are. We represent overall within this country nearly 7 million working people. Being part of a trade union brings clear benefits for working people. It provides them with better legal representation in the workplace to resolve issues at work. It will often provide them with better access to training. It will provide them with better career opportunities. We do very much hope that this bill will actually encourage and enable more people to make the positive choice of joining trade unions, whether it's through a right of access, providing millions of workers, regrettably the majority of workers in this country at the moment, who don't have the opportunity to meet with a trade union in the workplace. We also hope the bill, through measures on the fair pay agreement, the new negotiating arrangements on school support staff and the changes is statutory recognition, will enable more workers to actually have a say over their pay terms and conditions. We also hope that through the introduction of statutory equality rights, it will ensure that issues such as harassment, bullying, sex discrimination, unequal pay within the workplace can be properly addressed within this country, to ensure that all companies, we know there are good companies who meet good standards in the workplace, we would like to see more companies, more organisations meeting those standards, and we very much hope this bill is a starting point to ensuring that everybody has a decent working life.
Can I just ask you, as you've raised the term working people within that, something that some struggle to define, can you define working person, and does that include someone who runs a business? Are they a working person?
There is already, sorry, may I answer the question? I think it was directed at me. There is already within legislation statutory definitions of who are workers, and it will generally be workers, in some instances employees, who will benefit from the range of rights within this legislation. All trade unions are also looking forward to working with the government on their forthcoming review of employment status, the purpose of which may well be to look at extending protections for self-employed workers, freelancers and others. Certainly within Unite, we represent a lot of self-employed workers in the construction industry. They are there not by choice as self-employed. They have fewer rights because they're self-employed. We would certainly like to see workers who have higher risk of injury in the workplace, who often lose out on pay and conditions. We would like to see them, as well as freelance and others, having the full employment rights. So we're working initially from the definition of worker and employee that is set out in law, but we very much look forward to the government bringing forward measures to extend protections to all working people.
And this is a question to all of you, but it's off the back of your last answer. It was suggested in the last evidence session that this bill does not go far enough. It's evident from the declarations that were made at the start that the relationship between the trade union movement and the Labour Party is symbiotic. So what more have you actually asked the government to see, to put into this bill? Where do you want it to go further? Mick Lynch gave a very clear answer in the previous session. What are your respective unions' greater asks of this government?
Can I just make a point, first of all, about the symbiotic nature of the relationship between Labour and the unions? We certainly have a shared history and shared values, and in some cases we have unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party. The TUC represents those 5.3 million workers, regardless of who is in government, and doesn't have a formal relationship with the Labour Party. Listen, our job as trade unionists is always to want more and better for working people. I think it's important to acknowledge that this will be the biggest upgrade to workers' rights, I was going to say in a generation, but not in a generation, actually more than that, in decades. And it will directly benefit millions of working people. I came in at the end of the evidence session before, and Mick was talking about sectoral collective bargaining. The government has indicated that the first fair pay agreement will be in social care. We would love to see that approach, those fair pay agreements, rolled out to other sectors of the economy. That's a point that we will make going forward. But I think it would be churlish not to accept that this is a big upgrade to workers' rights, a big upgrade to union rights. In fact, in my 35 years as a union activist, this will be the first time that government has repealed anti-union legislation. And I think it's really important that it does. If you take that minimum services level legislation as an example, I think that legislation we always warned would be unworkable. It was red flagged by the Regulatory Policy Committee and by the government's own impact assessment when it was introduced, and not a single employer has ever used the legislation. So I think we'll be positive. Of course, there will always be more that we would like to see any government do on behalf of working people, but I think this is a really important piece of legislation.
I would agree, and to be frank, as the largest trade union in the country, it doesn't matter the political stripe of the government. Will obviously do what we can to improve public services and obviously the terms and conditions and the salaries of those workers in public services. I think you asked if there was what more we would want. I think, to be honest with you, I suppose it's an extension of what's already in the bill, and that's around the opportunity of some form of legal mechanism where we could have collective claims. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of individual workers, trade unions when they're involved, but also employers and employment tribunals are spent trying to deal with individual claims from individual workers. And if you're talking about, I suppose, if you like, an unintended consequence of that would be the actual savings to employers when it comes to having to deal with individual claims and the years it takes when it goes through tribunals. If there was an opportunity to have a mechanism where we could deal with it collectively, it would save everyone time and money, including employers.
We have a disproportionate number of 0 hours contracts in Scotland, which is probably in relation to the fact we have more small businesses as a proportion of the UK economy. We obviously welcome within the bill the fact that there are moves to address that from our perspective, and I did hear the evidence previously. We know the majority of employers don't use them, but we do know the intensive impacts that they have. For the last 10 years, the STUC has run a campaign called Better Than Zero, which has really day and daily been out talking to these predominantly young workers, far from all being young workers, and the impact on their lives, but ergo the impact on the economy, because their lack of stability, their lack of certainty, their lack of security has a far wider effect than just the individual, can't be underestimated. And therefore, when we look at the provisions that are currently in the bill, we ask ourselves, we certainly believe that when we're talking about what defines a short hours contract, and some of the other things which have yet to be decided, that we need these to be really, really quite strong, because if you go out there, if you go onto the internet, you can already see discussions amongst employers about how they're going to circumvent the current proposals. So that will be one area where we'd be looking for strength.
Thank you very much. I mean, there is an awful lot to welcome within this bill. I'm not going to take up the committee's time by listing it. We can submit you with evidence around equality rights, trade union rights, etc. However, I'm sure with all the committee members, we're keen to ensure that this bill comes out providing watertight legislation that makes a real difference to working people's rights. And there are some elements of the bill that we would want to work with you as a committee and also to continue to work with the government to tighten up what we consider to be potential loopholes. I'd name 3 areas just very briefly. First of all, the provisions on fire and rehire. Unite's concerns are that potentially some of the uses of heavy-handed tactics by employers seen during the pandemic and since could still be lawful under this bill. We are concerned that employers may be able to justify fire and rehire in certain circumstances. Our view is that there needs to be a total ban on the use of fire and rehire. We are not confident that the employment tribunals will look behind the corporate veil or will question employers' arguments to say that they need to use fire and rehire tactics. So we don't think it goes far enough. And importantly, there is nothing in the bill at the present time that actually stops the employer from sacking the workforce. Whilst we welcome the government's consultation on interim relief, we, like the previous participants, would like to see some measures before that actually stops the employer, requires the employer to open their books, to actually demonstrate to forensic accountants that changes are needed and provide a genuine opportunity for negotiation with trade unions. We're very equipped. We know what needs to be done if changes are needed. Secondly, we would like to see further measures in the bill to extend collective bargaining, but very briefly, we recognise on the statutory recognition provisions there are important measures within the bill. We would, however, like the government to consider going further, in particular to ensure that there are laws that prevent the abusive practices seen at the recent Amazon campaign, but also that there are faster routes. Workers often have to wait for 6 months and repeatedly asked, do you want statutory recognition? They repeatedly say, yes, we want statutory recognition, but employers are given time to fight against the workers' will. We think there should be a faster route to automatic recognition. And the last point I'd raise is on access. I've already talked about the benefits of working working people having the opportunity to meet with trade unions in the workplace, to tackle discrimination, to press for better pay and conditions, for negotiation. But we would like to ask the government to look at the access measures to try to see if there are ways of having a default or freestanding right of access, so working people have a genuine right to democracy and representation at work.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Ms Vance. Good afternoon, everyone. I wonder if I could just start to question to you, first of all, Paul. You referenced this £13 billion benefit, which I think is some research that's just recently been published by the TUC. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that would actually look like in terms of benefits to individuals?
The research was based on a very modest estimate, taken from the government's own suggestions that there would be improvements on things like productivity, reduced absenteeism, bringing people back into the workforce who currently find it difficult to access the workforce because they have, for example, care and responsibilities, need to balance work and family life. And we assumed a 1% uptick across those measures. As I say, a very modest assessment, £13 billion positive impact to the UK economy. And in many ways, what this does is just reflect what already happens in unionised workplaces. I mean, one of the things I do as General Secretary of the TUC is visit workplaces up and down the country, large and small, and some of the most successful, most productive employers in this country, whether it's Airbus or Jaguar Land Rover or Rolls-Royce, or indeed our largest private sector retailer, are employers that have close working relationships with trade unions and do treat their staff with respect. I mean, I think this legislation is really important, Minister, because it does what it says in the tin. It's about making work pay. And for far too many people in this country, work doesn't pay at the moment. We've got a problem with low-paid, insecure employment. Over 1 million people on 0 hours contracts. Overwhelmingly, when you ask those individuals if they'd like the right to guaranteed hours, I mean, poll after poll shows 80% plus say they would. When you play that out in practice, for example, I know that the Work Foundation did some work with Wetherspoons. When Wetherspoons offered their staff the option between 0 hours and guaranteed hours, 99% of the staff took the guaranteed hours. And that's good for those workers, but as I said before, it's also good for employers because workers who are securely employed, who feel good about their work, who are supported in work, are more productive. Employers are more likely to invest in them. So I genuinely do believe that this is legislation that is win-win. Win for employees and workers, but win for employers as well, and good for the UK economy overall.
Thank you for that answer. You've certainly been able to quantify a lot of the evidence we've had today about the benefits of the bill. I don't know if anyone else giving evidence wants to add anything to that on the particular benefits to the economy and wider society.
Thank you, Minister. I think when you have low-paid workers who will take a sector within UNISON, within the care sector, who are on, in some cases there are contracts, who are working and away from home potentially 10, 12 hours a day, but only getting paid for 5 of those. The amount of money they put it locally into their economy is going to be a lot smaller than if you had a fair pay agreement where you had proper regulation, that they were paid adequate salaries, better opportunities for them to train. And we have to bear in mind that the care sector has one of the largest vacancy rates, 130,000 vacancies within the care sector at the moment, simply because care workers are either taking on additional jobs and part-time jobs in the evening and the morning, I don't know when they have time, or they're basically taking jobs in supermarkets or in call centres because they can get paid far more. If they are paid a better rate of salary, they will be putting more money into their local economy. They will be paying more tax, and ultimately it will have that's the benefit it will have for the economy from that particular sector, which 130,000 vacancies, this is a growing problem. We are an ageing population. Having a properly remunerated workforce when it comes to social care will have nothing but a benefit. It's very hard to quantify how that much will be. It all depends on what the fair pay agreement comes out with.
I'll maybe just quote a number of different quantifications, and I know that small business, in particular hospitality, has been a large focus for this bill, but also more generally. if you look at the type of estimates that are made by hospitality businesses on the cost of staff turnover, I mean, it's anything from £5,000 an employee, you can find estimates of £15,000 an employee, none of them are my estimates. And then you consider that it's an incredibly high turnover industry, and we were talking 30 plus turnover, and you just work out, and I haven't done the sums, but because there's various estimates, and you just work out how a relative improvement in retention would impact the hospitality sector, then I think that some of the measures here which would, we believe, retain and encourage lower paid hospitality members to stay in the workplace would have an incredible impact.
Yeah, just very briefly to come in at the end, we do hope this bill will lead to expansion in collective bargaining, because it is the tried and tested method internationally recognised as the best way of improving pay and conditions, but also in reducing staff turnover. We know there's a skills shortage in this country. Actually reducing turnover and investing in skills, which is what trade unions work with employers to do, we believe will have significant economic benefits, including also improved productivity. Today, I must confess, I quickly read the RPC report, which raised questions about, are the measures in this bill justified? As a trade unionist who speaks on a daily basis to working people, there is not a single measure within this bill that is not needed. One of the risks with impact assessments, as carried out by the government, and we hope the government will look at this, is it often captures quantitative data but does not look at the qualitative data. What is the actual experience of working people that they're experiencing in the workplace? Where is the harm and what needs to be addressed? We know, for example, in hospitality, one of the big issues that our members face is lack of security or certainty over hours. The cost of childcare for hospitality workers are huge. The inability to pay for rent or to even dream of saving for a mortgage are very significant problems. But there are also real problems of harassment, sexual harassment. I know one of the things that really surprised me, the RPC said they could not see a justification for further regulation of third-party harassment. Just some own statistics. The NHS staff survey this year showed that 8.67% of NHS staff experience some form of harassment by the public or patients every year. We know that there are major staff shortages within the NHS. Exposing our workforce to harassment by third parties is one major problem. And in hospitality, it's far more rife. Unite did our own survey that showed that 89% of our members reported being subject to some form of sexual harassment in the last year. Many of them, 56%, were saying that was by customers, and at least half of our members were saying they were considering leaving the workplace because of the sexual harassment they've experienced. There are many issues, rights within this bill which we believe will help deliver better employment and also support businesses to become more productive and more profitable.
Clearly, RPC didn't talk to any of you before producing their report. Could I just ask you a little bit about something that came out in the evidence this morning, which was a concern that where there is a recognition ballot and the numbers voting in it is actually doesn't demonstrate a majority of workers in the workplace. It may be a simple majority in terms of people who voted, but it's not actually a majority of workers. There's some concern expressed that may not be a true voice of the workforce, and it was almost implicit that there would be another mechanism for that voice to be heard. I wondered if you would have anything to say about those particular concerns.
I think it's a misplaced concern. Literally, union recognition ballots are the only democratic test that we have, where we would expect not only to get simple majorities, but to have 40% of those eligible to vote in favour. And I think it puts a barrier in place towards unionisation. We wouldn't use that democratic test in a parliamentary election, a local council election, the election of a leader of a political party. And I think it seems perverse to put that obligation onto unions in workplaces. Listen, unions derive their credibility and their ability to represent people from being genuinely representative of the workforce. And it's in nobody's interest to have a union that only represents a minority of the workforce. Unions are always striving to represent the majority of the workforce in workplaces, and I think that we do that, and we prove that very effectively in workplace after workplace. At the moment, what we've got is a system that effectively the system is gained towards hostile employers to frustrate the will of people to join a union. We effectively count abstentions as no votes. Again, that's a democratic test that we wouldn't put up anywhere else. And so I think, taken alongside the other provisions in the bill, including the union right to access the workplace, the simplification of the recognition procedure, I think is really important in representing the democratic view of the workforce. And going back to a previous point, I think it's important to say this, Minister, no piece of legislation requires people to join a union, requires a workforce to vote for union recognition. All of those decisions rest with the workers themselves. That's a really important underpinning point for the way that we do trade unionism in this country. But I think what we do is get a level playing field for unions with this change in legislation.
Anyone else want to come back on that one?
Can I just make the point, because I keep hearing lots of stuff around, it's almost like unions are the enemy. Sometimes when you hear certain businesses talk, unions have a common goal with every employer where we organise, and that is for that organisation to do well, because then that means the staff and the workers will do well as well. Especially in the sectors that I represent, we have an absolute common goal with all the public sector bodies. We want good quality public services. And actually working with trade unions is the best way of being able to achieve that, and good employers know that. Good employers know that working with us will save them time, money, energy. They will have a workforce that is much happier in what they're doing. They'll be more productive, less sick days. The statistics are all around. So actually putting additional barriers in place where workers can't undertake a fundamental right of joining a trade union, I think it's a false barrier, to be perfectly honest with you, because if workers really want to join, they will.
Could I just very, very briefly, on the access issue, individual workers should have the right to say yes or no, but in order to exercise their right, they need to know the possibility, and the possibility comes from very simple but hopefully very straightforward and not bureaucratic arrangements, but which expect of an employer once in a while to provide access for the union to speak to those workers. It should be really, really simple, and you don't get to exercise the right to say yes or no if you don't know in the first place.
And a quick comment, I totally agree with the points on access. I think, trying to think of it from an employer's perspective, if a substantial number of workers within your workplace are saying we want trade union recognition, ignoring that, saying no to those requests, must have an impact in terms of staff morale. But one of the points we'd also want to add is our concern at the present time is that the statutory recognition provisions are not balanced. All the provisions at the present time tend to be weighted too much to the employer, because the employer can delay the process, which provides them with more and more time during statutory recognition to invest resources and to put pressure on workers not to vote for recognition. We welcome the consultation from the government. We want to work with the government to try and strengthen those provisions, absolutely to provide much earlier access, so it becomes the norm in the workplace that the trade union is present, that workers can ask questions, but also stronger unfair practice provisions. I know we look at international practice, I noticed in the States just last week, the National Labour Relations Board made it unlawful for employers to actually hold meetings with staff, the purpose of which is to try to convince them not to support recognition. Could you imagine a law within the UK, and we hope we could get to that point, where actually there's a level playing field, where employers cannot create a hostile environment to say to workers, you cannot have a democratic right, you cannot have your choice to have a say, and that's what collective bargaining is, giving workers a say over their own pay, their own terms and conditions. This is not something that's foreign, this is just about empowering workers to have their own voice heard by their own employer.
Can I just say to the panel, we've got lots of members who want to ask questions. If you could please be brief, but also not necessarily repeat what everyone else has said. And if you want to put in written evidence, then you can do that. I'll call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Steve Darling.
Thank you, Chair. It's been touched on before, but I just really wanted to understand from anybody who could address this. Productivity, it is a big issue for the British economy. Are there any opportunities you see through this bill of driving a bit harder towards that goal?
Absolutely, Mr. Darling. I mean, I think the evidence is clear from research undertaken by, for example, the Resolution Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The employers tend to invest less in staff who are insecurely and low paid. And what we want to do is create a situation where employers are investing in staff. We have a problem in the UK. If you look at employer investment in skills, it's about half the EU average. And so I think we want to move away from a low-skill, high-turnover situation. I mean, somebody talked before about the impact of staff churn. I was at an employer at the end of last week where they had 46% staff turnover each and every single year. And as the trade union representatives pointed out to me, every new person being recruited by that business works out around about £4,500 per person. So I think actually it incentivises employers to invest in their staff, to invest in the way that they use staff, and it certainly will have a positive impact on productivity. So I think that the fact when you give workers a collective voice, they're more likely to be able to work with employers on things like the introduction of new technology, how we're going to get to net zero in a way that secures good quality employment, what does that mean for training. It really does open up the potential for much more productive working relationships.
Okay, Uma Kumaran.
Thank you, Chair. Panel, thank you for your thoughts and your representations today. My constituency in Stratford and Bow has a rich history. I'm sad that the Honourable Member for Mid Buckinghamshire isn't here at the moment to listen to this, but we are rooted in the fights for working people, rooted in the fight for the rights for working people. It's the site of the 1888 London Bryant and May strike, better known as the Match Girls strike. Paul, 136 years ago, Sarah Chapman was first elected as the TUC rep from the then formed Matchmakers Union. She fought ardently for women's rights, and she made great representations at the TUC for women's rights. But it's been 136 years, and there's still much more to do for women in the workplace. I'm really pleased to see that the TUC has said that Labour's Employment Rights Bill was so vital for women's pay and equality. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on why you think this is and the reflections from the panel.
Well, it'll be good to hear from colleagues from UNISON Unite who directly represent hundreds of thousands of women at work. We know, for example, that women are more likely to be employed on 0 hours contracts. We know they're more likely to be in low-paid occupations. I think things like the fair pay agreements and social care could have a transformative impact on the lives of hundreds of thousands of women who go out to work. That's alongside all of the other provisions in the bill, for example, the presumption around flexible working, which will allow people to balance work and family life, but also crucially allow us to bring people back into the labour movement, into the labour market, who at the moment are struggling to find work that suits caring and other responsibilities. And I think there is a whole range of provisions in the bill that have a direct positive impact on women at work and direct impact on those sectors that we know low-paid, insecure employment is most concentrated in retail, in social care, in hospitality.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. So I represent UNISON. We're 80% women. I think I said at the very beginning about the significant difference this bill will make. But I'll just give you some examples. So Paul touched on flexible working. This bill, you could sum it up in lots of different ways, but it is going to make such a difference to carers who care for a profession, but also carers who have caring responsibilities outside, most of whom are predominantly women. The other area, I won't touch on the fair pay agreement because Paul has, but the other area is the reinstatement of the SSSMB for school support staff. Again, majority women, majority working part-time. It will be transformative for those workers to have a set standard terms and conditions, opportunities of training, salary and not have to take part-time jobs outside of their schoolwork to be able to make ends meet. That will be the transformation for women.
And we've been fortunate in Scotland, not completely fortunate, to get a little bit of a head start with respect to some of the discussion, particularly about low-paid care workers. And we've got a very, very strong developing consensus that care workers' voices and women's voices in the collective bargaining arena is something that we want to develop in Scotland. It's something that I think the bill may just have to address for Scotland, because it's one of those situations where, because of the devolved nature of the delivery of care, there may be powers that we need to invest in the Secretary, in the Scottish Government rather than the Secretary of State. That's something that we would intend to submit to the committee on. But I think that we've got really, really good early indications that a living wage in care for care workers, the full involvement of unionised care workers in the delivery and the shaping of their service can pay enormous dividends. We're a long way from getting it right in Scotland, but I think we've got a good start there, which I hope that some of the legislation here will reflect on too.
And just very briefly to say, I fully endorse what colleagues have said. I'm not going to repeat it so as not to take the committee's time, but also to recognise that many women part of trade unions because they want their voices heard and they want to be able to address issues such as inequality, such as bullying, such as pay discrimination in the workplace. And the introduction of equality reps' rights will provide an important focus to say that equality must be at the heart of the agenda, negotiating agenda within workplaces. But we also recognise alongside that there are improvements to parental rights which help to ensure there's fairer share of parental responsibility in the home, and also a recognition, we've already talked about a lot of zero-hours contract workers being women. One of the things that we're very aware of in hospitality, that too often employers bring in too many workers for shifts and say, sorry, we don't need you anymore, go home, cancel shift without any compensation for the workers, for their travel time, for their costs, for their childcare. We hope the bill will help to address some of those concerns.
Just following on, actually, listening to Mr Moxham's comments, I wonder, is there parts of the UK-wide bill that give you concern for employment rights in devolved nations, where devolved governments already have responsibility for employment relations? And isn't it time that employment laws should be devolved, as supported by the STUC, the TUC, of course, and Scottish Labour, and, of course, already exists in Northern Ireland, not least because it will help to protect us from future Conservative governments that may wish to repeal all the good legislation that's coming forward?
Well, we do believe, and there's a growing consensus in favour of the evolution of employment law to Scotland, but I think, as we all know, the bill can't achieve all of that, whether this committee was in agreement with it or not. What is of interest to us is the interface between employment law at a UK level and the responsibilities of the Scottish Government, which is obviously the employer of nearly all of, or the vast majority of the public sector in Scotland. And that's, in a sense, what I was referring to here, where through procurement and other regulations, the Scottish Government is working with us to deliver collective bargaining arrangements in Scotland, which have an interface and a potential complication, if not conflict, with what's in this bill. So we'd like it to be looked at there. I mean, it's important to recognise that not all employment law is reserved to Westminster. In Scotland, already the Agricultural Wages Board, employment tribunals, and a range of other things are devolved. So I do think, partly with respect to Wales, who I won't try to speak for, but definitely with respect to Scotland, that there may be aspects of this bill, particularly around this, that might need looked at in terms of the relative responsibilities of the two parliaments.
Dr Marie Tidball.
Why are the changes to statutory sick pay in the bill so significant, and what opportunities do they bring for disabled workers and those who have long-term health conditions?
Well, why is it so important at the moment? We've got 8 million people who are reliant on statutory sick pay, which doesn't kick in until day 3 of illness, and that means that you literally do have people often disabled workers, but not exclusively, dragging themselves into work despite the fact that they're ill, often spreading ill health. I'll give you a practical example, Dr. Tibble. I was at a mental health hospital in Blackpool last year where a group of women workers had to take strike action, working in an NHS mental health hospital because they didn't have access to day one sick pay. People who were going into an NHS setting when they were clearly unwell because they could not afford to take time off. We've also got an issue where we've got over 1 million very low paid workers, mainly women, who don't get any sick pay at all because they don't meet the lower ends threshold. So I think this will be transformative, and we'll get to a situation where people are not afraid to take time off if they're ill because they're worried about whether or not they're going to be able to pay the rent or the mortgage or the bills. So I think it's absolutely essential, and it's a really important part of those basic day one rights that every worker should be entitled to.
The only thing, I concur with everything that Paul said, the only thing I would add is that we end up with different workers working in the same workplace under different terms and conditions, and one group of workers who can't afford to take a day sick because they don't get paid, bringing in an illness potentially and infecting other people within not only the workforce but also for the public sector within the health health settings as well. So it will be significantly different for all of those.
As we saw from the pandemic, it's really horrendous when people feel they're pressured to go into work and putting themselves and their colleagues at risk. And so, therefore, day one rights to SSP is obviously really critical. We obviously, moving forward, like to see an uplift in SSP because we have still one of the lowest rates of statutory sick pay in Europe. But this bill represents a significant step forward, as indeed the recognition that there will be more collective bargaining because we as trade unions will negotiate for day one rights, often at full pay. Not just simply at statutory rights. But we also look forward, not just simply with this bill, but moving forward in terms of the wider make work pay measures to work with the government on the health and safety review. I think it's regrettable there isn't anything in the bill on health and safety. We hope that government will continue to prioritise that, addressing issues about mental health in the workplace, but also the impact of long COVID, which is disadvantaging some people. We recognise not everything could be done in this bill, but we look forward to that ongoing programme of work.
Thank you, Mrs. Vance. I've got 3 very quick questions with which you can answer very quickly, I think. You're obviously very pleased by the bill, and I know that countervailing power is important and it matters. So, firstly, would you characterise this as a fundamental act of rebalancing between capital and organised labour? Second, as the bill was prepared, how was the relationship with the department? How welcoming were they? Did ministers make sure you had an open door? And third, I know you'll hope that this means more collaborative relationship with employers in the way that you've described, but obviously the right to withdraw your labour is a very powerful thing. So do you think that there is a possibility that we will see more strikes ultimately as a result?
Could Mr. Timothy have a quick go at those questions? I wouldn't describe it as a fundamental rebalancing. I'd describe it before, as I said, the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in decades, and one that actually has been desperately needed for years. And I would actually say that there's, I hesitate to say this, a political consensus that this, if you want to describe it as a rebalancing, needs to take place. If you cast your mind back to 2016, 2017, Theresa May commissioned Matthew Taylor to undertake his review of modern employment practices. I think there were between 50 and 60 recommendations in his piece of work. The then government promised 20 times or more in Parliament that they would bring forward an employment bill and didn't, because actually a recognition under successive Conservative governments that we needed, that the labour market wasn't working, it was letting down far too many workers, but wasn't working on its own terms in terms of productivity and so on. So I hope there's a political consensus that we do need to shift the balance. On the relationship with the departments, I would say, I mean, I've been at the round tables with union colleagues, but also with representatives from the CBI and the other business organisations. And I think it genuinely has been a collaborative effort. What has been said to trade unions and what has been said to business has been exactly the same. The message has been consistent, and I think that's a good way of working. I don't think you can draw a line between this legislation and an increase in industrial action. And indeed, I'd flip that point. The previous government introduced the 2016 Trade Union Act, which was designed to make it harder, effectively, for workers to take industrial action. And then last year presided over the biggest strike wave in our recent history. I stood, not because I'm a sort of trade union anorak in these issues, but I stood on more picket lines last year than I have in the previous 20 years combined, despite the fact that it was made harder for workers to take industrial action. And actually, I think the focus of the previous government, and I think the focus of this government, is not trying to legislate industrial problems out of existence, but to try and resolve disputes and find ways of working together. Now, there will always be, I was on the Council of ACAS for 11 years, there will always be individual and collective disputes in workplaces. That's a fact of life in modern workplaces. How you manage those disputes, how you put in place the right proper framework of law to give workers effective voice, I think is really important, and I think this legislation helps do that.
The only thing I'd add to that is on that last point. Good industrial relations will mean less strikes. It's as simple as that. If workers feel that they are being listened to through their trade union, and we've been able to find a solution, hopefully, to any of the issues, the likelihood of workers feeling that they have no option but to take strike action will lessen.
Fully concur.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think from Unite's perspective, we would say this is a step towards rebalancing the power relations in the workplace. We think at the moment there are too many gaps in the bill, and we have to include in that 0 hours contracts. We think it's too easy for the employer to game the measures, but we look forward to working with the committee in terms of tightening those provisions up. Very briefly, I'd want to pay absolute tribute to the department for the work that it's done in recent weeks and months. The civil servants as well as the ministers for genuinely engaging. I've been in employment rights policy work for generations, never seen anything like this level of engagement in terms of civil servants and also ministers giving their time to both sides of industry. And just to reiterate the point as I think that has been made by UNISON, collaborative working relationships are dependent on both sides. Too often, and we have experienced that in recent years, employers have resorted to hard, strong-arm tactics such as fire and rehire, sacking workforces, driving up casualisation in the workplace. That increased insecurity, it damages morale in the workplace. We would like to be in workplaces where employers come to the table, have genuine negotiations, and recognising the importance of investing in the workplace, workforce, building security, and offering a genuine fair share of the outcomes from what workers do, not just simply increasing in the profit margin.
Thank you, Ms. Huss. We've heard a lot today from other witnesses about the benefits of flexibility of 0 hours contracts to businesses, but perhaps could you tell us a little bit about the impact of the uncertainty on your members of 0 hours contracts?
It has a massive uncertainty in terms of people not being able to plan their lives, not knowing whether they're going to be working enough hours to pay the bills, to meet the rent or mortgage at the end of the month. Overwhelmingly, those on 0 hours contracts want guaranteed hours. A vast majority of the British public, regardless of who they voted for at the last election, want to see an end to 0 hours contracts. And actually employers, we polled 1,000 employers, large, medium and small employers. 70% of them believe getting rid of 0 hours contracts will drive improvements in productivity. And just to make this final point, we hear a lot about the potential cost to employers, potential impact on recruitment and so on. I have to tell you, some of those points were made during the introduction of the minimum wage.
That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, can I thank you all for your evidence? We now move to the next panel. They never listen to me. Both of them carried on speaking. So rude. Order. We will now hear oral evidence from Gemma Oyhavsky, CEO of the Fawcett Society, and Jolie Brearley, founder and CEO of Pregnant Then Screwed. We have until 5 p.m. for this panel. Could the witnesses please briefly introduce themselves for the record?
Hi, I'm Gemma Oyhavsky, Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society. We're the UK's only member-powered organisation dedicated to ending sexism and misogyny for all women.
Hello, I'm Jolie Brearley. I'm the CEO and founder of Pregnant Then Screwed. We exist to end the motherhood penalty. We run support services for women who experience issues at work, and we campaign on issues we think cause the motherhood penalty.
Thank you. I call the Shadow Minister, Greg Smith.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. Can you give us your view on whether this bill goes far enough to combat the issues you campaign on, particularly around women's rights at work, and where you would like to see elements of it amended, either to be made stronger or to get rid of things that might have unintended consequences, and if there are any particular areas that give you concern in this bill that they might not deliver either what they say on the face of the bill they'll deliver, or they'll deliver something completely different. Who wants to go first? Jemima?
Thank you. So to begin with, we really welcome the bill at Fawcett. Overall, we still have an economy and workplaces that consistently disadvantage and exclude women. That means they're much more likely to be on zero-hour contracts, to be in low-paid work, and to be held back by a lack of access to quality, flexible part-time work. Each of those issues is intensified for most black and minoritised women and for disabled women. That results in serious consequences for individual women. So we have a gender pay gap of just under 14%. Women take home on average just a bit over £630 a month less than men. And of course, it also has a detrimental impact on our economy because it's a marker of the ways in which women are not fully participating and contributing at their full potential to our economy. And estimates indicate that that means we're missing out on tens of billions of pounds of GDP. So we strongly support the measures as an important step towards redressing that balance. And in particular, we're pleased to see the inclusion of equalities action plans as an important way to get employers to drive forward progress on the gender pay gap. We're glad to see the emphasis on the importance of flexible working and also that day one right to statutory sick pay, which will have a disproportionate beneficial impact on women, as well as further protection from sexual harassment in the workplace. 40% of women experience sexual harassment at some point during their career. There are areas where we would like to see additional inclusions or things go further. So on flexible working, which is incredibly important for women who have caring responsibilities and continue to do the majority of unpaid care. Having access to flexible work's really vital for being able to progress and earn at your full potential. And so we would like to see a duty on employers to advertise jobs as flexible, rather than women having to wait until they are in a job before they can begin that conversation. You can't move into a new job if you're not sure if you're going to be able to replicate the flexibility that you have in an existing role, and that leads to women being underemployed and their skills being underused. The day one rights to maternity, paternity and parental leave are important, but they have to be remunerated, and that has to be a day one right to pay if we actually want people to take it. And particularly if we want men to take on more caring roles, we need to make sure that we have a refocus on remunerated leave, and that includes parental leave. We welcome that there's going to be a review, but we need to think about this as part of those measures. I guess the other thing I would say is I'd like to see more around equal pay in the bill. And there are measures that could be taken that would support women to access fair pay, such as pay transparency, ending salary history questions. And then the last thing I'd add that I'd really like to see more on is making sure that there is proper enforcement of those rights. So making sure that the enforcement bodies are properly resourced and have the teeth to make sure that these rights really hold.
It's a big question you've asked. I obviously would support everything that Jemima has just said, and we are very supportive of this bill. I think there is a lack of clarity on some of the areas that we're really particularly interested in. So with flexible working, we're really pleased to see that the government want to make it the default way of working. This is really, really important, but we need to know exactly what the mechanisms are that are going to be in place to do that. The current law on flexible working isn't working. We want to see an advertising duty as well, which I'm sure we can explore in a bit more detail later. We also are very supportive of parental leave being moved to a day one right. I mean, it's kind of amazing that that isn't in place already, but without it being remunerated, then you're going to see take-up is going to be very, very low. We would have liked to have seen more on parental leave. We have a shockingly low rate of pay for maternity. We have the worst paternity benefit in Europe, and this is causing huge problems for families, particularly new families that have just had a baby. They're getting themselves into terrible amounts of debt, and also the way that our parental leave system is structured means that women are responsible for the care of a baby. They tend to take long periods of time out of work, whereas men tend to go back to work very, very quickly, so they fall into the role of breadwinner. The woman falls into the role of caregiver, and that continues for the rest of their lives, and hence why you see such a large gender pay gap. The redundancy protections are great. Again, really pleased to see that, but we need some specifics about what that means. We would like to see that pregnant women and new parents can only be made redundant in exceptional circumstances. So by that we mean when a business is closing or perhaps a service has stopped being delivered. It's very difficult if you are made redundant when you're pregnant or you've just had a baby to get another job. And often you're made redundant and then you can't access statutory maternity pay. So these are very particular circumstances. We know that many women are still being made redundant when they're pregnant or when they're new mums. 17% of calls we get to Pregnant Then Screwed are related to redundancy. So it is a big problem. But what we don't have at the moment, and we really need to have, is data that shows us what is happening on the ground. We had a report done by the Equality and Human Rights Commission under the coalition government, which found that 54,000 women a year are pushed out of their jobs for getting pregnant or for taking maternity leave. 77% of new mums experience some form of discrimination. That report was done in 2016. And there was a guarantee at that point that the report would be done again 5 years later. We are now 9 years later, and we still don't have any new data to show us exactly what is happening on the ground. So without that, we're sort of making decisions in the dark. So we'd really push for that report to be done again. We would have liked to have seen something in the bill on non-disclosure agreements. Our research finds that 435,293 mothers have been gagged by non-disclosure agreements when experiencing some form of discrimination. It's a serious problem. It means, again, we do not know what is happening in companies across the country. Women tend to experience this form of discrimination. They're forced to sign these agreements. They're given a low amount of compensation, and they suffer mental health consequences because of this. We want to see the UK follow what Ireland has recently done, so that non-disclosure agreements cannot be enforced unless the claimant wants them to be enforced. And then we would have also liked to have seen something in the bill on miscarriage leave, because at the moment you have no right to any leave or pay if you miscarry before 24 weeks. We would like to see something on fertility treatment. As many of you will know, we have a baby crisis in the UK. We're not having enough babies, so we really want to encourage people to be able to have fertility treatment, so we need a legal right to time off. We'd like to see something on reasonable adjustments. So you have reasonable adjustments at the moment if you have a disability, but you don't have reasonable adjustments if you have a dependent with a disability. And so many mothers of disabled children are really struggling in the workplace because they need time off for appointments or whatever it may be. And we would like to see all employees have to publish parental leave policies.
Minister Justin Madders.
Yeah, just one question, I think, probably mainly for Jemima, but obviously you want to chip in as well, you're welcome to. We've had it suggested by the Regulatory Policy Committee there is no evidence base for third-party harassment. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that particular criticism.
So there's strong evidence that the majority of sexual harassment that's experienced in the workplace comes from third parties. This is where someone experiences harassment from a client, customer, patient, and that some of those that are most vulnerable would include those working in retail and hospitality. It's absolutely essential that women, anyone working in those environments, is as safe as they can be and is respected in their workplace. We would consider it essential that employers that responsibility to take reasonable steps to prevent it includes those third parties, because as a victim, it's not relevant that that person wasn't a direct co-employee. What matters is the harm that you experience, and it is absolutely within the bounds of good practice and reasonable steps for employers to address that.
Nothing from me, it's not my area.
Thank you.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I visited in my constituency Torbay Torquay Girls Grammar School some time ago and met with the head and some of the sixth form students who were experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace throughout Torbay. And does the legislation that's proposed go far enough? I'm particularly reflecting to myself about young people who may lack confidence and what could be built in here to support them so that they can be calling this out, so it isn't just seen as, like other people may say, a bit of banter or something like that. It is something deep, hurtful and painful for those individuals, and the sooner we give them the support, the better. But I'd welcome your reflections on how this bill could be strengthened around this particular area. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I think having clear guidance and expectations around those reasonable steps that will prevent, which should include multiple reporting routes, which might be anonymous if that feels more appropriate. Training for managers. Our research shows that managers do want to respond appropriately, but often when those conversations come up, just don't know what the right thing to do is. And consequently, lots of those conversations end up going badly. And young people or employees don't get the support that they need. It's also really important that the enforcement agencies do have the resource to investigate whether those policies and procedures are in place, so that we actually can make sure we're embedding a culture of prevention rather than just responding decently when those incidents happen. And that is in the interest of employers too, because cultures where there is bullying, harassment are bad for productivity, they are bad for staff turnover. So it really is in everyone's interest to make sure we address this and cut it off at the pass.
The only thing I would add is that when you want to access justice, when you experience sexual harassment, or when you experience any form of discrimination, the justice system currently is failing women. It's not working. And we know, certainly in cases of pregnancy and maternity discrimination, fewer than 1% of women who have that experience even raise a tribunal claim. So part of what we need to do is extend that time limit to raise a claim. It's currently 3 months. It needs to be at least 6 months, so that women have the opportunity to recover from their experience before they start to go through that really onerous, difficult process of raising a tribunal claim.
Ms Brearley, I've read that you'll be leaving your role in the new year, so may I congratulate you on all you've achieved with your organisation and the tremendous advocate you've been for the causes of women's rights and equal work. When you look back at the journey that the conversation about gender equality has been on since you founded your organisation 10 years ago, do you feel that the steps in this bill have the potential to make lasting progress?
Since I started Pregnant Then Screwed 10 years ago, and I started it because of my own experience of pregnancy discrimination, I was pushed out of my job the day after I informed my employer that I was pregnant. And it was the tribunal time limit that prevented me from taking action against my employer. When I started campaigning on these various issues and talking to people within government about it, I honestly felt like nobody was listening. It really felt like, you know, you were banging your head against a brick wall. Nobody really had any interest in what we were talking about. And certainly over the last 10 years, the dial hasn't moved very much at all. But we've seen changes in flexible working law and changes in redundancy protections, but they really are minor tweaks. This bill does take a significant step forward, but of course I'm always going to say there is a lot more that we can do. And I think some of the, particularly the flexible working part of this bill, I was very excited to see, but if we don't get this right and cross the T's and dot the I's, then it will make very little difference whatsoever. But thank you for your comments, that's very kind.
Thank you. Jemima, you described this bill as a win for women. Why do you feel the measures in the bill are so transformative, and how do you think those measures will benefit working families, in particular women and disabled women?
So we know that women are more likely currently to miss out on statutory sick pay because they don't earn enough to meet the threshold or haven't been in their roles as long. You heard evidence earlier about the impact that that has on people either then having to try and work when they're not well enough, or the impact on incomes through not being able to work. Women are more likely to be juggling work and care, so they're more likely to need the flexibility and the protections that come in this bill, and that is why getting that piece around flexibility is so important, whether that is because you're caring for children, caring for disabled children, caring for elderly relatives, or indeed we know that from our research 1 in 10 women that we surveyed who had been experiencing the menopause had left their workplace as a result of their symptoms. Flexible work and support in the workplace is really important for enabling them to continue to participate when they're really, you know, at the peak of their careers and skill levels, and should be kind of allowed to thrive and be in their prime. We know that the majority of households in poverty have at least one adult in work, but at the moment we do not have a system that properly supports either lone parent families, which are predominantly women, or households where both parents want to work. We know that 40% of women who are not working would work more hours or would work paid hours if they had access to flexible working. So it's also really important as a part of overall efforts to address poverty and prevent child poverty.
Adding to what Jemima has said, particularly on flexible working, the current law is that you have a day one right to request flexible working, and that has obviously moved from it being 6 months in a job. A right to request is still a right to decline, and we really strongly feel that it doesn't go far enough in terms of changing the dial on flexible working. I know that the RPC opinion on flexible working has, that they've said that there's no evidence that we need to change the law on this. I mean, there's never going to be enough official evidence, because those that want flexible working tend to either ask for what they think they can get, or if they know that it's not going to be granted, they don't ask for it at all. And TUC research found that a third of people who want flexible working don't ask for any flexible working despite needing it, because they think it's going to be rejected, and a further third ask for what they think they can get rather than what they actually need to manage their personal and professional obligations. To really change the dial on flexible working, you've got to switch this on its head, and an advertising duty does this. Now, it's a hugely ambitious change. It's not a slight tweak to the current legislation, which is a much easier thing to do. But what an advertising duty does is ensures that employers are designing jobs as flexible from the outset. So it would mean that in a job advert, they had to stipulate the types of flexible working that were available, and the candidate that they chose would have a legal right to take up employment on whatever was stipulated in that job advert. The pushback on this has been, well, not all jobs can be flexible, and that's of course true. So if you don't believe that that job can be done flexibly, then you would be able to stipulate and set out the reasons why it can't be done flexibly. But this would mean that, particularly for the women that we work with, they're not moving jobs because they need at the moment to go to a new job, get that job, and then ask for the flexibility they need to be able to fulfill their personal and professional obligations. Now, if at that point they find out that that's not possible, they then have to leave that job, and both employer and employee lose out. So we're currently trying to shoehorn flexibility into a very rigid structure, and we need to really change the culture on this. And we believe that an advertising duty is the way that you do that. If we're not going to be that ambitious and an advertising duty is off the table, then what we really need to do is reduce the number of reasons that you can decline a flexible working request. We believe that it can be reduced to 3. We need to make the legal right to request flexible working to be from the point that a job is offered rather than the first day of employment. I mean, that just makes complete sense for everybody. And finally, we need to have the ability to appeal decisions to a third body, so perhaps to the single enforcement body. And also we want employees to have to publish their flexible working policies online so that employees can see them. It would be a game changer. It would really shift the way our employment market is working, and it certainly would be a game changer for women. The other thing that I really would like to talk about, which is in this bill as well, is parental leave, and the fact that it isn't remunerated, that you would move it to the first day of employment. We know that the take-up is going to be very low. We did some research with the Centre for Progressive Policy, which found that if you increase paternity leave to 6 weeks and pay it at 90% of salary, you reduce the gender pay gap by 4%, and you increase labour force participation, particularly by women. We really need now to keep up with our European counterparts and increase paternity leave. 2 weeks at £182 a week is not good enough. And we know that 1 in 4 dads aren't even taking their 2 weeks because they can't afford to do it. Families are losing out as a result of this. It's really bad for kids if dads and second parents are not enabled to spend time with their children. It's really bad for women. It is a big cause of the gender pay gap. So we'd really like to see the parental leave review happen as quickly as possible, and to see paternity leave increase, it be ring-fenced and paid properly.
On that flexible working, on that, Fawcett's been campaigning for that advertising duty, and absolutely agree it's really important to make this meaningful. I think it's important to recognise as well that this is good for employers because it increases the pool of talent they have access to, rather than only being able to get applications from people that meet a rigid but not relevant set of criteria. It broadens out to everyone who genuinely can do the job. So it benefits everyone and is hugely important for enabling women to succeed at work.
I wanted to explore just a little bit more, Julie, because my ears pricked up, when you talked about non-disclosure agreements and the thousands that are being signed, which is sign away complete rights of women. Could you tell me a bit more about your research, and can you also tell us a bit about what lessons have been learned from Ireland, because I really want to explore that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Non-disclosure agreements are a real problem. We don't know how many exist or how many women who experience discrimination. I'm saying women because I work with women. Of course, men sign them as well. We don't know how many women sign them because, of course, they're non-disclosure agreements. Nobody can talk about them. But we run a mentor program where we pair up women who are taking legal action against an employer with somebody who's been through that process. And 90% of the cases that we work with, they end up signing a non-disclosure agreement. 90%. It's a significant proportion. And often these are quite measly sums of money. They are pushed on women when they're feeling very vulnerable, and they're told that if they sign this non-disclosure agreement, they will get a really good reference, it will all go away, you get this lump sum of money, off you go. But what they mean is you can't talk about what has happened to anybody. You can talk about it legally to your spouse and to your lawyer, but that's about it. And so for the women that sign them, they really damage their mental health because they can't say what has happened to them. They sort of harbour and keep this dirty secret, You know, it really is very damaging to them. But it also means that we do not know what is happening behind the closed doors of companies. And I can tell you now, there are companies that win awards for being absolutely brilliant employers for women. And behind closed doors, what they're doing is pushing women out when they are pregnant and forcing them to sign non-disclosure agreements so they can't talk about it publicly. So along with Zelda Perkins, who runs Can't Buy My Silence, we would like to see that non-disclosure agreements are unenforceable unless the claimant, the person who is signing it, wants them to be enforced. And this is a piece of legislation that Ireland has just pushed through. So they have made them unenforceable unless the claimant would like them, but they've also made them unenforceable unless they are written documents. They're written in very clear language, because often non-disclosure agreements are really complicated to read and nobody can fully understand them. And also that there is still the opportunity to report what happened to a trade union and to the Ombudsman. So again, at the moment, nobody knows what is happening because by their very nature, they stop you talking to anybody. So we would like to see a similar change happen here.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for your presentations today, especially as I've followed your work, and I have a lot of friends that have followed Pregnant and Screwed as well, so thank you. Jemima, I've read actually the Fawcett Society's report on the gender pay gap and your views here, and actually listening to you both today has put some new questions in my head from what I thought I wanted to ask. You've both talked about maternity provisions and what this could mean for the country. I'd like to know more broadly, what's the benefit to the economy and to businesses of having stronger maternity provisions as set out in the bill?
By maternity provisions, do you mean maternity leave and
Yeah, maternity rights.
Maternity rights, yeah. So as I mentioned before, we know that 54,000 women a year are pushed out of their jobs from the point that they get pregnant, for either while pregnant, taking maternity leave, or just after they return. That's 1 in 9. It's a woman every 10 minutes. And what tends to happen to those women is it takes them a very, very long time to recover. And sometimes this is a slow drip feed of bullying and harassment, because people know that just pushing them out is unlawful and they could go to tribunal. So this is severely damaging to women's careers, but it's also severely damaging to their first year with their new baby. You know, it really damages their mental health. And it's a big contributor to the gender pay gap. We don't know exactly how much it contributes to the gender pay gap, but it obviously is a big contributor. So what we need to see, and what we've been campaigning for to change this, is firstly ring-fenced, properly paid paternity leave. Because until an employer sees any employee as somebody who could go off when they have a child, they will always have a bias towards women. And at the moment, men do not take time off, you know, maximum 2 weeks often, once they've become a father. And so they are not seen as a risk, whereas women are seen as a risk. And so that bias starts in the recruitment process. And so, but also we know that if we ring-fence paternity leave, pay it properly, men will take time out, and also that reduces the unpaid labour gap. So we know that men tend to do more of the unpaid labour, and so women can excel more in their careers. The second thing we need, and I know this isn't part of this committee, but I have to mention it, our childcare system is a chaotic mess. It needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible, and until that happens, women will take a step back from their careers. And we need enhanced redundancy protections, like what is in this bill, but we need it to be very specific, to be about if the business fails.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. On behalf of the committee, can I thank you both for the evidence that you gave. We'll now move to the next panel. Thank you. From CEO at the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, and we have until 5:15 for this witness. Could you just set out for the record who you are, your background?
Certainly. And first, thank you very much for inviting me to give evidence today. So I'm Alistair Eisner, Chief Executive at the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, but I also come here wearing a couple of other hats. I'm a member of the Construction Industry Joint Council, which is the largest collective agreement for the construction industry, representing about 250,000 employees. I'm also a member of the Construction Leadership Council, which is the umbrella body for the industry, through which I lead its culture of workplace activities to try and improve the workplaces for construction businesses.
Thank you. I call the Shadow Minister, Greg Smith.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for this late session in the day. The bill is multifaceted. It has a lot of measures in it. It could rapidly become a Christmas tree bill. What do you see from those that you represent are the good elements of it, and more significantly, those areas that perhaps need amendment or change to avoid unintended consequence, and what straightforwardly won't work for you?
One of the benefits of being tail-end Charlie is I've been able to watch some of the evidence from earlier on today, so I was primed for this question. So, look, I think from an industry perspective, the first reaction is it is a very big bill, and that does create challenges, because when I look at our industry, we have about 360,000 employers in the industry. More than half of those employ fewer than 4 people. And so actually getting to them to even raise awareness that this bill exists is a particular challenge. So in terms of how we take things forward, whatever happens through the rest of this process, I think there is a big engagement process that's required to raise awareness of the outcome. But that said, generally speaking, based on the feedback that we have had in relation to the bill, I think there's a lot of positivity about some elements of it, particularly around looking at tackling sexual harassment, looking at improving equality in the industry. I think our members would say that this is stuff that they do as custom and practice already, so it's almost raising the level of wider industry and trying to cut out poor behaviour among not bad actors in industry, but those that are less developed. I think there are a couple of points where we do have particular concerns. One is around the redundancy piece. I suspect as MPs you are all sick and tired of people special pleading saying their industry is different. But I'm afraid I'm going to say our industry is different. We deliver on a geographical basis, and when a project comes to an end, understandably there will be cases where redundancy is the only option. To enforce upon the whole business the requirement for consultation feels like it wasn't the intent of this policy, and so trying to find a way through that works seems like something that we should spend some time looking at. Productive outcomes there. I've seen personally the impact of people being on multiple rounds of redundancy, and it is miserable for the individual, and that's what I think we should seek to avoid. I think the other area we have some concerns about is around I think we've heard it a number of times today, is around day one unfair dismissal claims. In construction, it does take a lot of time to get people ready to work. It feels like going from 2 years and coming down to day one is a big step for an industry that, as I articulated earlier, may not be even aware that this is coming towards them. So I think we would want to look at how that might work. I'm sure you may have questions on that, so I don't want to sort of spend the time garbling on. I'd rather give you the chance to ask questions.
Specifics around how you feel it would be best to structure any change around those specific single projects. I know maybe the building of a railway station or something like that might take 2, 3, 4 years, and then that's it, cliff edge, project's over. And how would you best structure that?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the things that we've looked at is that there's the notification element and there's the consultation element. I suppose it's what's the policy trying to achieve? Because if it's trying to avoid people from almost hiding redundancies by doing them in small units, then I think ensuring that notification is still required I don't think we would have any complaints about that. It's the consultation where you're forcing people into consultation that they're never going to be made redundant, and yet they find themselves under the scope of this. So almost splitting those two things apart, so you would still have the notification, but you wouldn't necessarily have the consultation for those that are unaffected, is something that we're exploring. But I don't want to sort of say, well, that's the silver bullet that'll solve things. We haven't even discussed that collectively as an industry. It's just we're trying to consider what options might be on the table.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. I think you said you've got the largest collective agreement in the country. Congratulations on that. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what your members see as the advantages of that?
Ultimately, we won't work well as an industry. It's a cliche, but we rely on the people that we work with, and they must be represented. So having good, positive relationships with the employees' representatives is crucial. The CIJC has for decades now provided us with that vehicle. I should say it's not the largest overall, it's just the largest in the construction sector. But I just think back to COVID and when we needed to have a relationship with the workforce that provided us with the independence, and I have to say Unite was brilliant at that time to engage with the rest of the industry to say, you know, we're all working collectively towards a common good there. So I suppose when we were discussing this with some members over the last few days, one of the potential concerns, and I don't think it is written in the bill, but it's more in some of the discussion that's happened prior to the bill, is might this in some way undermine existing collective agreements? So that's I think what we would like to protect. I'm not going to pretend it's all sunshine and roses. Sometimes it could be quite challenging, but I think what we would want to do is ensure that whatever the outcome of this bill is, there is a strong positive partnership between the employers' representatives and the employees' representatives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not that long ago, I met with Sovereign Housing around developing more social rented housing in my constituency of Torbay, and they shared in the west of England, one of the biggest wicked issues was the lack of medium-sized builders to help deliver this good. I'm sure this is the case elsewhere in the country as well. Can you share whether you see this bill as being a positive impact on developing those potential positive engines of change for our country, or whether you see this bill having a negative impact on that, and what would you change?
I think it's very easy to, as an employers' representative body, to go, well, here are all the problems associated with the bill. I think we should be nervous about that because it does have a democratic mandate for what's going forward. Equally, I think we should also be honest and say we do see that this will create an additional burden for industry. What the nature of that is, I'm going to be very honest, we don't have good research at our industry level to know what that is. But it just seems palpable that there are going to be impacts, as there are with some of the other changes of policy that you would expect with a change between two governments. So I think, at the risk of looking like I'm trying to duck the question, there are both pros and cons about the bill, and it is as simple as that. I think the particular points that we have concerns about around the redundancy piece and around the day one unfair dismissal, those are the things we would probably want to focus on just specifically, because those are the ones that are likely to have the unintended consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Darling. Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's common ground that there are productivity challenges in construction that are particular to the industry, as well as a historic fragmentation of employment relationships. Do you see any opportunities for marrying levelling up of employment standards with productivity gains? And if I may as well, there's been some very important work in the industry on mental health, and I just wanted to place on record an appreciation of Seeker's positive role in supporting that work.
That's very kind. I wasn't expecting that at all. It's something we're extraordinarily passionate about. We've done a lot of work in relation to mental well-being, but I think it's also incredibly relevant to this committee because there is a big part about people's culture in the workplace, which we're looking at, that drives mental health. And unfortunately, as an industry, we do have a really poor mental well-being issue, particularly for those at the very bottom end of the skills levels. And that's our problem. We do need to do more about that. Sorry, I can't remember the specifics of your first question.
The question was, do you see opportunities for marrying levelling up of employment standards with productivity gains in construction?
So I think in terms of industry productivity, there is a lot to go at, but one of the biggest drivers is going to be around, in essence, people being happy, healthy at work, and being provided appropriate training that drives competence to deliver. So yes, I do think there's something there. I think ultimately there's also big challenges that sit outside the employment space about, at the minute, we're not even measuring productivity properly. So how we know whether we're improving or not starts with having the first clue as to what we're supposed to be measuring. I should say that there is good work going on in that space at the moment.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm particularly interested in migration and how migration has affected the labour market. And I know that the construction industry is an industry that's seen a lot of it. And there's certainly been a big public perception, whether the reality is true or not is up for debate, that sectors that saw high levels of migration over the last 10, 15 years also saw a degradation in working standards, spread of 0 hours contracts, wage undercutting, fire and rehire in these industries. I wonder if do you agree with that assessment? And not that it is the case, but that there's that perception. And would you say that a strengthening of workers' rights as proposed in this bill would bring reassurance to employees in your industry when the perception is that sort of global events, whether that be migration flows, but also just the changes in how capitalism's worked, that has affected them?
So on migration, I think one of the things that it has been characterised that construction sort of sought migrant labour as a way of sort of undermining cost for existing workforce. I'm a lobbyist. I hold my hands up and say I am a lobbyist for the industry, but that is just not true. We actually, a lot of people don't understand this, we are a relatively high-paying industry, and so where we were using migrant labour, it was because there was a lack of capacity in the industry, and it was almost a balancing item to meet that capacity. It was not about undermining costs. So I would have strong confidence that whatever we do in the space around employment rights, we're still going to have a challenge around meeting our future skills needs. I don't think migration is the answer. I think it's a long-term piece around us recruiting more effectively from domestically. Sorry, I'll
The point was about the perception that was the case. Mm-hmm. So do you think that doing measures like this will help combat that perception?
I think it can't hurt to have measures that make the world of work in the construction industry more attractive to try and defeat that perception. But I think there are much bigger factors in play in terms of why that's being driven, that perception exists.
And in the last minute, John Pearce.
Yes, just quickly. You're probably the second or third witness that's picked up on this establishment point and has raised the idea that if it's removed, it would require consultation with people that aren't at risk of redundancy. I'm interested in that interpretation because you would only need to consult with affected employees and their representatives, so it would only be people that are at risk of redundancy or are to be made redundant. So can you just clarify your understanding of that?
I should first clarify that I'm not an expert in redundancy. However, based on the conversations that we've had, I think you've got to look at how individual employers would respond to the new environment. And I don't think this would ever be the case, but almost there's a perception, would people feel that the only way out of this was just basically to almost have a permanent rolling redundancy consultation within their business to try and address the fact that there are people on geographical sites that are coming off and coming on all the time, and there's no other easy route under a new approach that would help address that issue.
Thank you very much for your evidence on behalf of the committee. Definitely not a tail end, Charlie. That brings us to the end of today's session. The committee will meet again at 11:30 on Thursday, the 28th of November, to continue hearing oral evidence on this bill. I invite the Government Whip to move the adjournment. The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.